There is a pyramid in Egypt that changed its mind halfway up. It rises from the desert floor at a steep angle, climbing toward the sky with the aggressive geometry of a monument that means to be the tallest thing on the horizon. And then, roughly halfway to the summit, the angle changes. The sides pull inward. The slope softens. The pyramid that began as a bold, steep-sided tower finishes as a cautious, shallow-angled cap, as though the builders suddenly lost their nerve or realized they were about to make a catastrophic mistake and corrected course in the only way available to them, by bending the pyramid while it was still being built. The result is a monument unlike anything else in the ancient world. It is lopsided, it is strange, it is visually jarring, and it is, in its own peculiar way, the most honest building in Egypt, because it shows something that no other pyramid shows. It shows the builders thinking. It shows them encountering a problem they had not anticipated. It shows them making a decision under pressure, with millions of tons of stone already in place, and choosing a solution that was imperfect but survivable. Every other pyramid in Egypt presents a finished surface, a smooth and perfect geometric form that reveals nothing about the process of its creation. The bent pyramid of Dahshur presents the process itself, frozen in limestone, visible to anyone who stands at its base and looks up at the strange, broken profile that has puzzled visitors for more than 4,500 years. The bent pyramid was built by a pharaoh named Sneferu, the founder of the Fourth Dynasty of Egypt and the father of Khufu, the man who would build the Great Pyramid at Giza. Sneferu is one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of human civilization, and he is also one of the least known. His son's monument, the Great Pyramid, is the most famous structure on Earth. Sneferu's monuments, scattered across 3 sites in the Nile Valley, are visited by almost no one. The pyramid field of Dahshur, where 2 of his 3 pyramids stand, was a restricted military zone until 1996, closed to tourists and scholars alike for decades. Its monuments visible only from a distance, its secrets guarded not by ancient curses, but by modern checkpoints and barbed wire. Even after the site was opened to the public, it has remained one of the least visited major archaeological sites in Egypt, overshadowed by the fame of Giza to the north and the antiquity of Saqqara to the south. The tourists do not come, the tour buses do not stop, and the 2 pyramids that Sneferu built at Dahshur, the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, stand in the desert in a silence that is almost total, 2 of the most important monuments in the history of human architecture, seen by fewer visitors in a year than the Great Pyramid receives in a single busy afternoon. And yet Sneferu moved more stone than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history. The numbers are striking. Khufu's Great Pyramid contains an estimated 2.3 million cubic meters of stone. Sneferu's 3 pyramids, taken together, contain an estimated 3.6 million cubic meters. Sneferu built more pyramid than Khufu. He built more pyramid than any human being who has ever lived. And he did it not by building one perfect monument, but by building 3 imperfect ones, each one a response to the failures of the last, each one a step closer to the form that his son would perfect at Giza. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what happened at Dahshur. You are going to stand at the base of the bent pyramid and look up at the angle change that records the most consequential engineering decision in the history of ancient architecture. You are going to walk through the Red Pyramid, the world's first successful true pyramid, and descend into its burial chamber, a corbelled vault of polished limestone that smells of ancient air and echoes with every footstep. You are going to meet the pharaoh who invented the true pyramid through trial and error, who failed spectacularly and publicly, and then succeeded brilliantly within the span of a single reign, and whose willingness to fail, to adapt, to try again, gave the world the architectural form that has defined Egypt in the human imagination for more than 4 millennia. And you are going to confront a question that the ruins of Dahshur pose with quiet but relentless insistence. What does it mean that the greatest architectural achievement in human history, the true pyramid form that has become the most recognizable geometric shape on Earth, was born not from perfection but from failure? What does it tell us about the nature of human achievement that the form which would define an entire civilization for 4,000 years was invented not by a genius who got it right the first time, but by a stubborn king who got it wrong twice and kept building until the stone obeyed his vision. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin. To understand what Sneferu achieved at Dahshur, you must first understand the problem he was trying to solve. The problem was geometric, theological, and structural, all at once, and it had never been solved before. Every pyramid that existed when Sneferu came to the throne around 2600 BC was a stepped pyramid, a structure composed of rectangular layers, stacked one on top of another like a wedding cake, each layer smaller than the one below. The stepped pyramid of Giza at Saqqara, built roughly a century earlier by the architect Imhotep, was the prototype. It rose in 6 distinct steps to a height of roughly 62 meters, and it was the tallest and most impressive monument in Egypt. But it was not a true pyramid. Its sides were not smooth. Its profile was not a continuous slope from base to apex. It was a staircase, a series of flat surfaces separated by vertical risers, and its geometry, however impressive, was fundamentally different from the smooth-sided form that we think of today when we hear the word pyramid. The theological distinction mattered enormously. The stepped pyramid was understood as a staircase to heaven, a physical structure that the dead king could climb to reach the circumpolar stars and join the gods. The true pyramid, the smooth-sided form, represented something different. It was a solidified ray of sunlight, a stone embodiment of the beams that the sun god Ra sent down from the sky to the earth. The capstone at the summit, called the Pyramidion or Benman stone, was the point where the rays converged, the place where earth and sky met, the spot where the divine light touched the human world. The transition from stepped to true pyramid was not merely an architectural evolution. It was a theological revolution, a fundamental change in the way Egyptians understood the relationship between the king, the sun, and the cosmos. Sneferu did not just build a new shape, he built a new theology in stone. But the engineering challenge was formidable. A stepped pyramid distributes its weight across a series of independent layers, each one structurally self-contained. If one layer settles or shifts, the damage is localized. A true pyramid distributes its weight along continuous inclined planes that extend from the base to the apex, and any structural failure at any point along those planes can cascade through the entire structure. The angle of the sides is critical. Too steep, and the weight of the upper courses pushes outward against the lower courses, with a force that can crack the foundation and cause the entire structure to collapse. Too shallow, and the pyramid becomes a low, spread-out mound that lacks the height and visual impact that the theological program demands. Finding the right angle, the angle that balanced structural stability against theological ambition, was the engineering problem that Sneferu spent his entire reign trying to solve. He began at Meidum, a site roughly 65 kilometers south of Cairo, where an earlier pyramid, possibly begun by his predecessor Huni, the last king of the Third Dynasty, stood in an incomplete state. The original structure at Meidum was a stepped pyramid, built in several phases, each one adding a new layer of casing to the existing structure. Sneferu's builders took this stepped pyramid and attempted to convert it into a true pyramid by filling in the steps with additional masonry and applying a smooth outer casing of limestone that would give the monument the continuous slope of a true pyramid. The conversion was a bold experiment. No one had ever attempted to transform a stepped pyramid into a true pyramid before. The engineering principles were untested. The structural behavior of the new form was unknown, and at some point during or after the construction, something went catastrophically wrong. The Meidum pyramid today is one of the strangest looking structures in Egypt. It does not look like a pyramid. It looks like a tower, a tall, steep-sided block of stone rising from a massive mound of rubble and sand that spreads outward from its base like a skirt. The original smooth casing is gone, and the stepped core is partially exposed, but the lower steps have collapsed entirely, leaving only the upper portion of the structure, standing like a stranded sentinel above the debris of its own failure. The question of when and why the outer layers collapsed has been debated by scholars for more than a century. with theories ranging from catastrophic construction failure to gradual post-construction deterioration. And the debate has never been fully resolved because the evidence supports elements of both interpretations simultaneously. The German Egyptologist Kurt Mendelssohn argued in the 1970s that the collapse occurred during construction, triggered by the failure of the smooth outer casing to bond properly with the stepped inner core. Mendelssohn proposed that the casing stones, laid on smooth beds that tilted inward rather than horizontally, slid outward under the weight of the upper courses, causing a catastrophic avalanche of stone that stripped the lower portions of the pyramid to the stepped core beneath. Other scholars, including the German archaeologist Rainer Stadelmann, have argued that the collapse was gradual, occurring over centuries as water infiltration and seismic activity weakened the bonds between the core and the casing. The timing of the collapse matters, because it determines whether Sneferu knew about the failure before he began building at Dahshur. If the collapse occurred during construction, as Mendelssohn proposed, then Sneferu would have witnessed the failure of his first attempt to build a true pyramid and would have brought that experience to bear on his next project. If the collapse was gradual, occurring long after Sneferu's death, then the Meidum experience may not have directly influenced the design decisions at Dahshur. The scholarly consensus has shifted over the decades, but the current majority view, supported by archaeological evidence from the debris field around the Meidum pyramid, leans toward a combination. Significant structural problems may have become apparent during or shortly after construction, prompting Sneferu to abandon Meidum as his burial site and begin construction at a new location. That new location was Dahshur, a stretch of desert plateau approximately 40 kilometers south of modern Cairo on the western edge of the Nile floodplain. The site was virgin ground. No major monuments had been built there before. The limestone bedrock was firm and level, offering a stable foundation for heavy construction, and the location was sufficiently removed from the existing necropolis at Saqqara to create a distinct royal burial ground that would be associated exclusively with Sneferu and his dynasty. The choice of Dahshur was a fresh start, a deliberate break with the site of his first failure, and a statement of confidence that the engineering problems that had plagued Meidum could be solved. The pyramid that Sneferu began building at Dahshur is known today as the Bent Pyramid, and its construction history is one of the most dramatic episodes in the story of ancient architecture. The original plan called for a true pyramid, with sides rising at an angle of approximately 54 degrees, a steep inclination that would have produced a tall, narrow monument of striking visual impact. The base was laid out at approximately 189 meters on each side, and construction began according to the standard technique of the period. Courses of locally quarried limestone laid in horizontal beds with an outer casing of fine white Tura limestone that would give the finished monument its smooth, reflective surface. The construction proceeded without apparent difficulty through the lower courses. The foundation was solid, the bedrock was stable, the workforce was experienced, the logistics were functioning smoothly, and then, at a height of roughly 49 meters above the base, something changed. The angle of the pyramid's sides shifted abruptly from 54 degrees to approximately 43 degrees. The steep, aggressive slope of the lower section gave way to a much shallower angle that continued to the summit. The result was the distinctive bent profile that gives the pyramid its modern name, a profile that is visible from kilometers away and that has no parallel anywhere in the ancient world. The reason for the angle change has been the subject of intense scholarly debate, and the debate itself is a window into the way archaeologists think about the relationship between ambition and constraint in ancient construction. The most widely accepted explanation, championed by the Egyptian archaeologist Ahmed Fakhri, who conducted extensive excavations at Dahshur in the 1950s and refined by Stadelmann in subsequent decades, is that the builders encountered serious structural problems during construction. At the original angle of 54 degrees, the weight of the upper courses was pressing outward against the casing stones with a force that exceeded the friction holding them in place. Cracks were appearing in the internal chambers. The ceiling of the lower burial chamber A corbelled vault of massive limestone blocks was showing signs of stress, with individual blocks shifting out of alignment and gaps opening between courses. The builders were watching the pyramid begin to fail in real time, and they were faced with a choice: continue at the original angle and risk a catastrophic collapse, or reduce the angle and accept a shorter, less visually impressive monument that would at least remain standing. They chose survival over ambition. The angle change at the 49-meter mark was an emergency correction, a mid-construction adaptation that prioritized structural stability over the theological imperative to build a tall, steep-sided monument. The decision was not taken lightly. Changing the angle of a pyramid that is already under construction is an enormously complex engineering operation. Every course above the transition point must be recalculated, the workforce must be retrained, the logistics of stone supply must be adjusted, the entire project plan must be revised. And the visible result, a pyramid with a broken profile, a monument that advertises its own compromise to everyone who sees it, must have been a source of considerable embarrassment to a king whose theological legitimacy depended on the perfection of his funerary monument. The bent pyramid was not supposed to be bent. It was supposed to be straight, tall, and perfect. The bend is a scar, a record of failure, a permanent admission that the builders did not get it right. But here is the detail that transforms the bent pyramid from a story of failure into something far more profound. The bent pyramid still has most of its original limestone casing. This is extraordinary. Almost every other pyramid in Egypt has been stripped of its casing stones. The polished white limestone blocks quarried away by later builders who needed the pre-cut stone for their own construction projects. The Great Pyramid of Giza has lost virtually all of its casing. The Step Pyramid of Djoser has lost its casing. The pyramids of Abu Sir, Saqqara and Lisht have all been stripped, but the bent pyramid retains a substantial portion of its original casing, particularly on the upper section where the polished limestone surfaces still gleam in the desert sun, with something approaching their original brightness. The casing survives because the bent pyramid was never used as a quarry, probably because its awkward shape and the difficulty of removing stones from its steeply angled lower section made it an inconvenient source of building material. The pyramid that failed architecturally succeeded in preservation. Its imperfection saved it. Its awkwardness protected it. And today, the bent pyramid offers something that no other large pyramid in Egypt can offer: a glimpse of what a pyramid actually looked like when it was new, when its surfaces were smooth and white and reflective, when it caught the light of the desert sun and threw it back toward the sky like a beacon of solidified light. The Red Pyramid, built approximately 2 kilometers north of the bent pyramid on the same Dahshur plateau, represents Sneferu's response to the bent pyramid's structural problems. Having learned from the near failure of the bent pyramid, Sneferu's builders adopted the shallower angle of 43 degrees that had been used for the upper portion of the bent pyramid and applied it consistently from base to apex. The result was the first true pyramid in the modern sense of the term, a smooth-sided, geometrically consistent monument that rose from a square base to a pointed summit at a uniform angle. The Red Pyramid's base measures approximately 220 meters on each side, making it the third largest pyramid in Egypt after the Great Pyramid and the Pyramid of Khafre at Giza. Its original height was approximately 104 meters. It is called the Red Pyramid because the local limestone used for its core has a reddish hue that is visible now that the original white Tura limestone casing has been stripped away. When the casing was intact, the Red Pyramid would have appeared as white and as gleaming as any of the monuments at Giza. Its colour was a secret, hidden behind the polished surface, revealed only when the casing was removed. The construction of the Red Pyramid was itself a monument to the lessons learned from the Bent Pyramid and from Meidum. The angle was conservative, 43 degrees rather than the 54 degrees that had caused problems at the Bent Pyramid. The courses were laid horizontally rather than at the inward tilting angle that may have contributed to the casing failure at Meidum. The internal chambers were designed with massive corbelled ceilings that distributed the weight of the pyramid above them. across a series of overlapping courses, each one projecting slightly inward from the one below, creating a self-supporting arch that could withstand the enormous loads without the cracking and shifting that had been observed in the bent pyramid's chambers. Every detail of the Red Pyramid's design reflects the experience gained from two previous failures, a body of hard-won engineering knowledge that was encoded in the stone of the monument itself. The interior of the Red Pyramid is one of the most atmospheric spaces in Egyptian archaeology, and it is accessible to modern visitors in a way that few other pyramid interiors are. A narrow passage descends from an entrance high on the northern face of the pyramid, dropping at a steep angle for roughly 63 meters, before leveling out and opening into a sequence of 3 chambers, 2 at ground level and 1 elevated above the second. The lower chambers are tall, narrow spaces with corbelled ceilings that rise in a series of overlapping courses to a height of roughly 12 meters, creating a soaring, cathedral-like interior that is utterly unexpected inside a structure that appears, from the outside, to be a solid mass of stone. The acoustics are remarkable. Every sound echoes and reverberates through the corbelled vaults, creating a resonance that makes the space feel alive, as though the stone itself is breathing. The air inside the pyramid is dense, humid, and laden with a chemical smell that has been described variously as ammonia, bat guano, and the decay of ancient organic material. The experience of descending into the Red Pyramid and standing in its cobbled chamber, surrounded by massive limestone blocks that have not moved in more than 4,500 years, is one of the most powerful sensory encounters that Egyptian archaeology has to offer. The upper chamber, reached by a short ascending passage from the second chamber, is the room that most scholars identify as the intended burial chamber of Sneferu himself. It is smaller than the lower chambers, but equally impressive in its construction, with a corbelled ceiling that rises in 11 courses to a height of roughly 15 meters. When the German Archaeological Institute examined this chamber in the 1990s, under the direction of Rainer Stadelmann, they found fragments of a mummified body scattered across the floor, mixed with fragments of linen wrapping and traces of funerary equipment. The fragments were badly damaged and had been disturbed by ancient tomb robbers, but their presence suggested that the Red Pyramid had indeed been used for a royal burial, making it the likely final resting place of Sneferu himself. If this identification is correct, then the Red Pyramid is not merely the first true pyramid. It is the tomb of the man who invented the true pyramid, the place where the founder of the Fourth Dynasty was laid to rest, in a monument that represented the culmination of an entire reign spent perfecting the art of pyramid construction. Sneferu's reign lasted approximately 24 years, according to the most commonly accepted chronology, though some scholars have proposed a longer reign of up to 30 or even 40 years. During that time, he built 3 pyramids: the modified stepped pyramid at Meidum, the bent pyramid at Dahshur, and the red pyramid at Dahshur. The total volume of stone in these 3 monuments exceeds the total volume of stone in the Great Pyramid of Khufu, making Sneferu the single most prolific pyramid builder in Egyptian history. The logistical achievement is staggering. To quarry, transport, and place the estimated 3.6 million cubic meters of stone that his 3 pyramids contain, Sneferu's workforce would have needed to move an average of roughly 150,000 cubic meters of stone per year, every year, for the duration of his reign. This is a rate of construction that rivals and possibly exceeds the rate at which the Great Pyramid was built, and it was sustained not for a single project, but across 3 simultaneous or sequential building campaigns at 3 different sites. The resources required for this effort were enormous. The quarries at Tura, on the eastern bank of the Nile opposite the Dahshur plateau, provided the fine white limestone used for the casings of all 3 pyramids. The local quarries at Dahshur and Meidum provided the coarser limestone used for the cores. Granite for internal elements, including the portcullis blocks that sealed the passages and the possible sarcophagus in the burial chamber, was transported from quarries at Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south. The workforce, estimated at between 20,000 and 30,000 laborers during peak construction periods, needed to be housed, fed, organized into work teams, equipped with tools, and managed by a hierarchy of overseers, architects, and scribes. The administrative infrastructure needed to coordinate this effort was itself a major undertaking, requiring a central planning authority, a communication network linking the construction sites to the quarries and the supply depots, and a system of record-keeping that could track the movement of thousands of individual stone blocks from quarry face to final position. The Palermo stone, a fragmentary royal annal carved on a slab of black basalt that is now divided between museums in Palermo, Cairo, and London, preserves portions of the year-by-year records of Sneferu's reign. The surviving entries mention military campaigns in Nubia and Libya, the importation of cedar timber from Lebanon in fleets of 40 ships, the construction of royal palaces and temples, and the founding of new towns. The picture that emerges from these fragments is of a king of extraordinary energy and ambition, a ruler who was simultaneously building pyramids, waging wars, conducting foreign trade, and founding settlements across the length of Egypt. Sneferu was not merely a builder, he was a state builder, a king, who used the pyramid construction program as the engine of a broader project of national organization and expansion. The British Egyptologist I.E.S. Edwards, whose work on the pyramids of Egypt remained the standard reference for decades, described Sneferu as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of the pyramid builders. Edwards's assessment was based not on the size of any individual monument, but on the cumulative achievement of Sneferu's building program, which transformed the pyramid from an experimental architectural form into a perfected, replicable design that could be executed by any sufficiently organized state. Sneferu did not merely build pyramids, he solved the pyramid. He worked through the engineering problems, absorbed the structural failures, refined the design parameters, and produced a final form, the true pyramid at the consistent angle of 43 degrees that his successors could adopt without modification. Khufu's Great Pyramid, the most famous building on Earth, is built at an angle of approximately 51 degrees, steeper than Sneferu's Red Pyramid, but based on the same fundamental engineering principles that Sneferu's builders developed through trial and error at Meidum and Dahshur. The Great Pyramid is Khufu's achievement. The engineering that made it possible is Sneferu's. The modern archaeological exploration of Dahshur has been shaped by the site's unusual history of access and restriction. The earliest serious excavations were conducted by the French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan in the 1890s, but de Morgan focused primarily on the Middle Kingdom pyramids at the southern end of the site. The pyramids of Amenemhat II, Senusret III, and Amenemhat III, rather than on Sneferu's monuments. The first systematic investigation of the Bent Pyramid was conducted by Ahmed Fakhri, an Egyptian archaeologist of exceptional ability, who began excavating at Dahshur in 1951. Fakhri's work at the Bent Pyramid was groundbreaking. He cleared the mortuary temple on the east face of the pyramid, documented the internal chambers with careful plans and photographs, and explored the subsidiary pyramid that stands to the south of the main monument, a smaller satellite pyramid that may have served as a symbolic tomb for the king's Ka, his spiritual double. Fakhri's excavation of the Bent Pyramid's interior revealed the complexity of the structure's internal layout. The Bent Pyramid is unique among Egyptian pyramids in having two separate internal entrance systems, one on the northern face and one on the western face, each leading to its own chamber. The northern entrance descends at a steep angle to a lower chamber, with a corbelled ceiling roughly 24 meters high. The western entrance leads to a separate upper chamber, also with a corbelled ceiling, at a higher level within the pyramid's mass. The relationship between these two chamber systems has puzzled scholars for decades. Some have interpreted the dual system as a reflection of the dual nature of Egyptian kingship, representing the king's authority over both Upper and Lower Egypt. Others have proposed that the upper chamber was a later addition, designed after structural problems in the lower chamber made it unsuitable for the royal burial. The question remains unresolved, and the Bent Pyramid's dual chamber system continues to generate scholarly debate and occasional controversy. The satellite pyramid adjacent to the Bent Pyramid is itself a monument of considerable interest. It stands roughly 55 meters to the south of the main pyramid, and its base measures approximately 26 meters on each side. Its original height has been estimated at roughly 26 meters, and its sides rise at the steep angle of approximately 44 degrees. The satellite pyramid has its own internal chamber system, accessed by a descending passage on the northern face, and Khafre found evidence of a wooden framework inside the chamber that may have been the remains of a portable shrine or canopy. The function of satellite pyramids in the Egyptian pyramid complex has been debated extensively, with theories ranging from the storage of the king's viscera to the housing of the royal ka to the provision of a symbolic southern tomb, replicating the dual tomb pattern that is found in earlier royal funerary complexes. The bent pyramid complex also included a valley temple, connected to the mortuary temple by a long causeway that descended from the desert plateau to the edge of the cultivation. The valley temple, excavated by Khafre and later re-examined by the German Archaeological Institute, contained some of the earliest known examples of large-scale royal statuary in the round. Fragments of limestone statues depicting Sneferu in the regalia of Egyptian kingship. These statues, though badly damaged, provide important evidence for the development of royal portraiture during the Fourth Dynasty, and suggest that Sneferu's builders were pushing the boundaries of artistic innovation in sculpture as well as in architecture. The full significance of what Sneferu achieved at Dahshur was not fully appreciated until the site was opened to broader archaeological access in the late 20th century. For decades, the military restrictions that limited access to the plateau meant that the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid could be studied only from a distance, their internal chambers inaccessible, their surrounding complexes unexcavated, their relationship to each other and to the broader landscape of the Memphite necropolis poorly understood. The opening of the site in 1996 and the subsequent decades of sustained archaeological work by Egyptian, German, and international teams have transformed our understanding of Dahshur from a site of two impressive but poorly documented monuments into one of the most important archaeological complexes in Egypt, a laboratory of architectural innovation where the most consequential engineering decisions in the history of human construction were made, tested, and refined over the course of a single extraordinary reign. And this is where the story takes a turn that most accounts of the pyramids prefer to skip, because the engineering triumphs at Dahshur are inseparable from the engineering failures that preceded them, and the relationship between the failures and the triumphs tells us something about the nature of human achievement that goes far beyond ancient Egypt. The core problem of Dahshur is a problem of interpretation. The Bent Pyramid is the most visually distinctive monument in Egypt, a structure whose broken profile has been photographed, analysed, debated, and speculated about for more than 2 centuries. But the interpretive question that it raises is more profound than any architectural analysis can resolve. The question is not merely why the angle changed. The question is what the angle change means, what it tells us about the relationship between ambition and reality, between the vision of what a monument should be, and the physical constraints of what stone and gravity will actually permit. And the answer, when it finally comes into focus, is one that applies far beyond the realm of ancient engineering. The structural crisis that produced the Bent Pyramid's angle change was not a sudden event. It was a process, a gradual accumulation of warning signs that the builders recognized, interpreted, and responded to over a period of months or possibly years. The evidence for this gradual recognition is preserved in the fabric of the monument itself. The internal chambers of the Bent Pyramid show signs of structural distress that predate the angle change. In the lower chamber, the corbelled ceiling blocks have shifted out of their original positions, and ancient repair work is visible in the form of cedar logs and plaster that were inserted into the gaps between the blocks to prevent further movement. These repairs are not modern interventions. They were made by the original builders during construction as they attempted to stabilize a chamber that was showing signs of failure under the enormous weight of the pyramid above it. The cedar logs, imported from Lebanon at considerable expense, were wedged into the cracks like splints on a broken bone, a desperate attempt to hold the structure together while the construction above continued. The image of the builders standing inside a chamber that is actively cracking under the weight of millions of tons of stone above them, inserting cedar logs into widening gaps while deciding whether to continue building or to change the plan is one of the most dramatic and most humanizing scenes in the entire history of architecture. These were not abstract planners working from blueprints in a comfortable office. These were men inside a failing structure, making engineering decisions under conditions of extreme physical danger and intense political pressure. The king expected a pyramid. The gods required a pyramid. The theological legitimacy of the entire state depended on the successful completion of a pyramid. And the pyramid was failing. The stone was cracking. The chambers were shifting. The ceiling was moving. And the builders had to decide in real time, with the full weight of the Egyptian state's expectations pressing down on them as heavily as the stone pressed down on the chambers, what to do. What they did was brilliant. They did not abandon the project. They did not tear down what had been built and start over. They adapted. They changed the angle. They accepted a compromise that would produce a monument that was imperfect but survivable. A pyramid that was shorter and stranger than planned, but that would remain standing. The decision required enormous courage because it meant admitting, publicly and permanently, that the original design had been wrong. The bent pyramid would stand forever as a visible record of failure, a monument that advertised its own compromise to every person who saw it. The builders chose honesty over pretension. They chose survival over perfection. And the pyramid that resulted from that choice has outlasted every other monument of its era, precisely because it was designed for structural reality rather than theological idealism. But here is the problem. The bent pyramid's angle change is not the only evidence of structural crisis in the Dahshur pyramids. The Red Pyramid, Sneferu's third and final pyramid, was built at the conservative angle of 43 degrees specifically to avoid the problems that had plagued the bent pyramid. But the Red Pyramid's internal chambers show their own signs of structural stress. The corbelled ceilings, while more stable than those in the bent pyramid, still show evidence of minor shifting and settlement. The passage that connects the second and third chambers has a slight but measurable deviation from its intended alignment, suggesting that the weight of the pyramid above caused some movement during or shortly after construction. These are minor problems compared to the crisis at the bent pyramid, but they demonstrate that the engineering of large-scale stone structures was, even at the end of Sneferu's reign, a process of approximation rather than certainty. The builders were pushing the limits of what stone could do, and the stone was pushing back. The question of why Sneferu built 3 pyramids has generated a scholarly debate that is among the most persistent in Egyptology. The simplest explanation is sequential failure and correction. Meidum failed, so Sneferu started again at Dahshur. The bent pyramid encountered structural problems, so Sneferu started again with the Red Pyramid. In this reading, the 3 pyramids represent 3 attempts to solve the same problem, each one incorporating the lessons learned from the previous failure. The progression from Meidum to the bent pyramid to the Red Pyramid is, in this view, a straightforward narrative of engineering refinement, a series of experiments that converged on a successful design through the elimination of unsuccessful alternatives. But this explanation, while attractive in its simplicity, does not fully account for the evidence. The bent pyramid, despite its structural problems, was not abandoned. It was completed. The casing was finished. The mortuary temple was built. The satellite pyramid was constructed. The causeway was laid. The valley temple was erected. If the bent pyramid was merely a failed experiment, a discarded prototype on the way to the Red Pyramid, why was so much effort invested in completing its complex? Why build a mortuary temple for a pyramid that the king did not intend to use? The completion of the bent pyramid complex suggests that Sneferu intended to use the monument in some capacity, even after its structural problems became apparent and even after the Red Pyramid was begun as a replacement burial site. Some scholars have proposed that the bent pyramid served a ceremonial rather than a funerary function, perhaps housing the king's car, his spiritual double, or serving as a symbolic southern tomb, replicating the ancient pattern of dual royal tombs that predates the pyramid tradition. Others have suggested that Sneferu intended to be buried in the Bent Pyramid but changed his mind when the Red Pyramid offered a more structurally sound alternative. Still others have proposed that the three pyramids represent three distinct phases of Sneferu's theological program, each one expressing a different aspect of the king's relationship with the solar cult that he was promoting as the central element of Egyptian royal ideology. The question remains open, and the evidence, as is so often the case in Egyptian archaeology, supports multiple interpretations without conclusively confirming any of them. And it gets worse, or rather more complex. The relationship between the three pyramids raises the broader question of how the ancient Egyptians understood failure. The modern Western concept of failure is heavily influenced by industrial and commercial models, in which failure is a deviation from a predetermined standard, a defect to be eliminated, a problem to be solved and never repeated. The Egyptian concept may have been fundamentally different. The Bent Pyramid was not hidden. It was not demolished. It was not covered over or disguised. It was completed, decorated, and maintained with the same care that was lavished on the Red Pyramid. Whatever the Bent Pyramid represented to the Egyptians, it was not something to be ashamed of. It was not a failure in the modern sense. It was something else, perhaps a legitimate stage in a process that the Egyptians understood as inherently progressive, a necessary step in the journey from ignorance to knowledge, from imperfection to perfection. This interpretation is supported by what we know about Egyptian attitudes toward the creative process in other domains. The instruction of Ptahhotep, one of the oldest works of wisdom literature in the world, composed during the Fifth Dynasty and attributed to a vizier who served under the king Isesi, contains passages that describe the acquisition of knowledge as a process of continuous learning, of listening, observing, making mistakes, and refining one's understanding through experience. The text does not condemn failure. It treats failure as a natural and necessary part of the learning process, a stage through which every person must pass on the way to competence. If this attitude toward learning extended to the domain of architecture and engineering, then the Bent Pyramid may not have been perceived as a failure at all. It may have been understood as a stage in a process, a necessary step in the development of the pyramid form, as essential to the final achievement as the Red Pyramid itself. The landscape of Dahshur embodies this progressive narrative in stone. Stand on the desert plateau between the two pyramids and look south toward the Bent Pyramid, and then turn north toward the Red Pyramid, and you are looking at the two halves of a single story. The Bent Pyramid is the question. The Red Pyramid is the answer. The Bent Pyramid is the struggle. The Red Pyramid is the resolution. The Bent Pyramid is the experiment. The Red Pyramid is the conclusion. Together, they form a diptych, a paired monument to the process of invention, and the distance between them, the 2 kilometers of empty desert that separates the compromise from the achievement, is the physical measure of the journey from failure to success. But the story of Dahshur does not end with Sneferu. The site was reused as a royal necropolis more than 700 years after Sneferu's death, when the kings of the 12th Dynasty returned to the area and built their own pyramids on the same desert plateau. Amenemhat II, Senusret III, and Amenemhat III all constructed pyramid complexes at Dahshur, creating a second cluster of royal monuments that transformed the southern end of the site into a necropolis of considerable size and complexity. These Middle Kingdom pyramids are very different from Sneferu's monuments. They are smaller, built with mud brick cores rather than solid stone, and they incorporate the elaborate subterranean anti-robbery devices that characterized Middle Kingdom pyramid design. The Pyramid of Senusret III, in particular, is renowned for the complexity of its substructure, which includes a labyrinthine system of passages, dead-end corridors, and concealed chambers designed to confuse and frustrate tomb robbers. The contrast between Sneferu's massive stone pyramids and the Middle Kingdom mud brick monuments on the same plateau is itself a visual essay on the trajectory of the pyramid tradition, from the monumental ambition of the Fourth Dynasty to the institutional sophistication and physical compromise of the 12th. The proximity of these different pyramids, separated by centuries but occupying the same stretch of desert, creates a landscape that is uniquely rich in archaeological meaning. Walk from the Red Pyramid to the Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III, a distance of roughly 3 kilometers, and you traverse more than 700 years of Egyptian history, from the confident experimentation of the early Fourth Dynasty to the institutional maturity of the late 12th. The pyramids along this walk mark the trajectory of a tradition, from its invention through its perfection, through its long, slow diminution, and the physical landscape embodies the arc of that trajectory in a way that no written account can fully capture. The monuments grow smaller, the materials change from stone to brick, the surfaces shift from polished limestone to eroded mud. The trajectory is downward, and the landscape tells the story without words. But here is what makes this truly terrifying, not for the ancient Egyptians, but for anyone trying to understand the nature of civilizational achievement. The entire trajectory of the pyramid tradition, from the invention of the true pyramid at Dahshur to the last completed royal pyramid built by the 13th dynasty pharaoh Kenja at South Saqqara, spans roughly 800 years. 800 years from invention to extinction. That is a long time by any human measure, longer than the interval separating the present day from the High Middle Ages of Europe. It is longer than the entire history of the United States, from its founding to the present. It is longer than the duration of the Roman Republic. It is longer than the interval between the Norman conquest of England and the present day. 800 years of continuous practice, of accumulated expertise, of refined technique, of institutional investment and theological commitment. And at the end of those 800 years, the tradition was dead. The skills were lost. The knowledge was gone. The pyramid stood empty in the desert, and no one alive knew how to build another one. The speed of the loss is not what makes it terrifying. What makes it terrifying is the contrast between the pace of invention and the pace of decline. Sneferu invented the true pyramid in roughly 24 years. The tradition that he founded took roughly 800 years to die. The creation was fast. The destruction was slow. The invention required a single extraordinary reign. The extinction required centuries of gradual erosion, of diminishing resources, of shrinking monuments, of institutional overextension, of political fragmentation, of the slow, accumulative loss of the concentrated royal authority that had made the Great Pyramid possible. Sneferu's achievement was a burst of creative energy that transformed the landscape of Egypt in a single generation. The loss of that achievement was a process so gradual that no single generation could perceive it happening. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how civilizations lose their capabilities. We tend to imagine loss as the mirror image of creation, as a process that is equally dramatic, equally compressed, equally visible. But the evidence from Dahshur suggests the opposite. Creation is fast, loss is slow. The invention of a new form can happen in a single reign. The extinction of that form takes centuries, each generation building slightly smaller, slightly cheaper, slightly less ambitiously, until the gap between the original achievement and the current capability has grown so wide that the original achievement seems impossible, seems superhuman, seems like the work of gods or giants rather than the work of people who were, in every important respect, identical to the people who have lost the ability to replicate what they built. The bent pyramid is the physical embodiment of the moment of creation, the moment when the true pyramid was being invented in real time, through trial and error, through failure and adaptation, through the willingness to change course, when the evidence demanded it. The pyramid tradition died slowly, over centuries, through a process so gradual that it was invisible to those who were living through it. But it was fast, in a single reign, on a desert plateau 40 kilometers south of Cairo, in the hands of builders who did not know whether what they were attempting was possible and who were willing to fail publicly in order to find out. That willingness to fail is the most important thing that Dahshur has to teach us. The bent pyramid is not a monument to failure. It is a monument to the courage that failure requires. The courage to attempt something that has never been done before, to encounter the unexpected, to adapt in real time, and to produce a result that is imperfect but real, a result that works, a result that stands. The builders of the bent pyramid did not produce a perfect pyramid. They produced something better. They produced the knowledge of how to build a perfect pyramid, knowledge that would be applied within a few years to the construction of the Red Pyramid and, within a generation, to the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. The failure was the price of the knowledge, and the knowledge was worth the price. The workers who built the Dahshur pyramids left traces of themselves in the fabric of the monuments. On the backs of casing stones, on the rough surfaces of core blocks that were never intended to be seen, on the walls of internal chambers and passages, the builders inscribed graffiti that provide fleeting but vivid glimpses of the human beings behind the stone. These inscriptions include team names, short phrases that identified the work gangs responsible for quarrying, transporting, and placing specific blocks. Team names recovered from the Dahshur pyramids include phrases that translate roughly as Friends of Sneferu and Drunkards of Sneferu, designations that combine official recognition with a casual, almost irreverent familiarity that suggests a relationship between the king and his workforce characterized by loyalty, perhaps genuine affection, and certainly a degree of organizational identity and team spirit that went far beyond mere compulsion or coercion. The workers were not slaves, as popular mythology has long and persistently insisted, despite the accumulating weight of archaeological evidence to the contrary. They were organized professionals, working in named teams with competitive identities and distinctive banners, motivated by a sophisticated combination of royal authority, religious obligation, economic incentive, and institutional pride that made the pyramid construction project not merely a burden imposed from above, but a collective enterprise in which the workers themselves had a genuine stake. The graffiti also include date marks that have been crucial for establishing the chronology of construction. Red paint marks on individual blocks record the year, month, and sometimes the day on which a block was quarried or placed, and these marks, accumulated across hundreds of blocks, have allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the pace of construction with remarkable precision. The date marks on the Red Pyramid suggest that the monument was constructed over a period of roughly 17 years, with the rate of block placement accelerating in the early phases and slowing in the later phases as the pyramid neared completion and the upper courses became more difficult to reach. The data reveal a construction process that was carefully managed and systematically recorded, with each block's placement documented as part of a comprehensive tracking system that anticipated the quality control methods of modern manufacturing by more than 4,000 years. The experimental methodology that produced the Dahshur pyramids has no exact parallel in the modern world, but it finds its closest analogues in the development of complex engineering systems, where the consequences of failure are catastrophic and the parameters of success are poorly understood. The development of early aviation provides a suggestive comparison. The Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, like Sneferu at Dahshur, were attempting something that had never been done before. They built multiple prototypes, each one incorporating the lessons learned from the testing of the previous one. They experienced failures, crashes, and structural breakdowns that forced them to revise their designs in real time. They worked without comprehensive theoretical models, relying instead on empirical observation, trial and error, and the willingness to be surprised by results that contradicted their expectations. And they succeeded, not because they got it right the first time, but because they persisted through the failures until the design converged on a solution that worked. The parallel is not perfect. The Wright brothers were working with wood and fabric at a scale measured in meters. Sneferu was working with limestone at a scale measured in hundreds of meters. But the methodology, the iterative process of design, test, fail, revise, and test again, is structurally identical. The space programs of the 20th century provide another parallel that illuminates the Dahshur methodology from a different angle. The early rocket programs of the United States and the Soviet Union were characterized by a high rate of failure, with multiple test launches ending in explosions, structural breakdowns, and catastrophic malfunctions before the designs were refined to the point of reliability. Each failure provided data, each explosion revealed a weakness, each breakdown identified a parameter that the engineers had not adequately understood. The process was expensive, dangerous, and politically humiliating, but it produced results: progressively more reliable rockets that could carry progressively heavier payloads to progressively higher altitudes. The engineers did not achieve reliability by designing a perfect rocket on the first attempt. They achieved it by building rockets that failed and learning from the failures. Sneferu's pyramid program followed the same logic. Meidum failed. The bent pyramid encountered structural problems. The red pyramid succeeded. Each monument was a test, and the failures were as essential to the final success as the success itself. But here is the problem with the trial and error interpretation. It treats the bent pyramid and the Meidum pyramid as mistakes, as failed experiments, whose value lies entirely in the lessons they taught. This interpretation, while valid from an engineering perspective, misses something important about the human dimension of the Dahshur story. The people who built the bent pyramid did not experience it as an experiment. They experienced it as their life's work. The quarrymen who cut the stone, the haulers who dragged the blocks, the masons who dressed the casing, the surveyors who laid out the angles, the overseers who managed the teams. These people devoted years of their lives to a project that would be remembered for millennia, primarily for its failure. They did not know that they were building a prototype. They thought they were building a pyramid. They thought they were building a monument that would stand forever, that would protect their king in the afterlife, that would maintain the cosmic order for eternity. They believed in what they were doing, and the fact that what they built turned out to be a stepping stone towards someone else's achievement, a necessary failure on the way to someone else's success, does not diminish the sincerity of their belief or the magnitude of their effort. The debt that Khufu owed to Sneferu and that the Great Pyramid owed to the Bent Pyramid is one of the most profound and most frequently overlooked debts in the history of human achievement. Without Sneferu's failures, there would have been no Great Pyramid. Without the Bent Pyramid's angle change, there would have been no Red Pyramid. Without the structural crisis in the Bent Pyramid's chambers, there would have been no corbelled vaults in the Great Pyramid's Grand Gallery. Every detail of the Great Pyramid's design, from the angle of its sides to the construction of its internal chambers to the technique used to lay its courses, reflects the accumulated experience of Sneferu's 24-year building program. The Great Pyramid is the capstone of a process that began at Meidum and was refined at Dahshur. It is the beneficiary of every failure, every compromise, every emergency correction that Sneferu's builders made during the course of their extraordinary experimental program. And the fact that Khufu's name is known to every schoolchild on Earth, while Sneferu's name is known to almost no one, is itself a commentary on the way human memory treats the relationship between the person who invents and the person who perfects. There is one more dimension of the Dahshur story that belongs in this section because it concerns a quality of the Bent Pyramid that no other major pyramid in Egypt possesses, and that transforms the monument from a historical curiosity into something approaching a revelation. The Bent Pyramid retains most of its original limestone casing. This fact, noted earlier, deserves to be dwelt upon at length because its implications extend far beyond the merely architectural. Every other large pyramid in Egypt has been stripped of its casing. The Great Pyramid, which was originally covered in polished Tura limestone that would have reflected the desert sun with a mirror-like brilliance, retains only a few courses of casing stones at its base, plus a small patch near the summit. The rest was quarried away during the medieval period, probably by Bari Mamluk rulers who needed building material for the mosques and fortifications of Cairo. The Pyramid of Khafre retains a cap of casing at its summit, giving it the distinctive layered appearance that is familiar from photographs, but the lower portions are stripped to the core. The pyramids at Abusir, Saqqara and Lisht have lost their casings almost entirely. The result is that the modern visitor to Egypt sees pyramids as rough, stepped, reddish-brown masses of exposed core stone. And this image, the image of the rough, unfinished-looking pyramid, has become the default mental picture of what a pyramid looks like. But this picture is wrong. It is the picture of a pyramid that has been stripped of its protective surface, a pyramid that has been quarried, a pyramid in a state of undress. The original pyramids, when they were new, looked nothing like this. They were smooth, they were white, they were luminous. They were designed to catch and reflect light, to glow in the desert sun, to be visible from vast distances as beacons of sulfurous radiance. The bent pyramid at Dahshur is the only large pyramid in Egypt where this original appearance can still be seen, not in a reconstruction or a model or an artist's impression, but in the actual surviving casing stones that still cover most of the monument's surface. The upper portion of the bent pyramid, the section above the angle change, where the shallower slope made the casing stones more difficult to remove, retains a nearly complete covering of polished Tura limestone that gleams in the sunlight with a brightness that is startling to visitors accustomed to the rough, brownish appearance of the stripped pyramids at Giza. Standing at the base of the bent pyramid and looking up at the surviving casing is one of the most transformative experiences in Egyptian archaeology, because it changes, permanently and irrevocably, your understanding of what a pyramid actually was. It was not a rough pile of stone. It was a machine for catching light. It was a geometric lens that focused the energy of the sun onto a single point at its summit and radiated that energy outward across the landscape. The polished surface was not a decoration. It was the functional element, the part of the pyramid that performed the theological work of connecting earth to sky, stone to light, king to sun god. The preservation of the bent pyramid's casing is paradoxical because the casing survives precisely because the pyramid failed. The bent pyramid was never used as a quarry because its awkward shape and its unstable lower section made it an inconvenient and potentially dangerous source of building material. The very qualities that made it a failure as a pyramid, its irregular profile, its structural instability, its deviation from the ideal geometric form, are the qualities that protected it from the quarrying that consumed every other major pyramid's casing in the Nile Valley. Failure preserved it. Perfection destroyed its successors. The Red Pyramid, which was a perfect true pyramid, has been stripped of virtually all its casing. The Bent Pyramid, which was an imperfect compromise, retains most of its casing intact. The monument that the builders considered a failure has survived in better condition than any monument they considered a success. The irony is as sharp and as permanent as the limestone itself. And it gets stranger. The Bent Pyramid's preservation means that it is, in a sense, the most complete large pyramid surviving from the Old Kingdom. The Great Pyramid is larger. The Red Pyramid is more geometrically perfect. But neither of them retains anything close to the proportion of original casing that the Bent Pyramid possesses. If completeness is measured not by size or perfection, but by the percentage of original fabric that survives, then the Bent Pyramid is the best preserved large pyramid in Egypt. The failure is the most complete. The compromise is the most intact. The monument that was supposed to be superseded by its successor has outlasted its successor in the most fundamental way possible. It has retained the surface that made it what it was, the polished skin that transformed a pile of stone into a monument of light. The Red Pyramid has been reduced to its core. The Bent Pyramid still has its face. The silence that surrounds Dahshur today is the silence of a place that has been overlooked and undervalued for too long. The two pyramids stand on the desert plateau, separated by 2 kilometers of empty sand, and between them they contain the entire story of the invention of the true pyramid, from the desperate improvisation of the angle change to the confident symmetry of the first successful true pyramid. The story is written in stone, in the geometry of the monuments, in the angle of the casing, in the cracks in the ceiling beams, in the cedar logs wedged into the gaps between shifting blocks, in the graffiti of workers who called themselves the Friends of Sneferu. It is a story of ambition, failure, adaptation, and ultimate success, told in a landscape that almost no one visits, by monuments that almost no one sees, in a silence that has lasted for more than 4,500 years, and that shows no sign of ending. The tourists go to Giza, the scholars publish their papers, the documentary filmmakers point their cameras at the Sphinx, and the Bent Pyramid stands in the desert sun, its polished casing gleaming against the sand, its broken profile testifying to the most consequential engineering decision in the history of ancient architecture, its silence unbroken except by the wind and by the occasional footsteps of a visitor who has come, against the current of popular indifference, to see the place where the true pyramid was born. The bent pyramid does not apologize for its shape. It does not explain itself. It does not offer excuses for the angle change that has defined it in the eyes of the world for 4.5 millennia. It simply stands, honest and imperfect and enduring, a monument not to perfection, but to the courage that made perfection possible by refusing to accept the alternative, which was collapse, which was catastrophe, which was the death of an idea before it had the chance to become real. The story of Dahshur gains its deepest resonance when Sneferu's experimental program is placed alongside other moments in human history, where the courage to fail publicly produced achievements that the courage to play safe never could have, because Sneferu was not the only builder in the ancient world to invent a new architectural form through trial and error, and the bent pyramid is not the only monument that bears the visible scars of the creative process. Across the ancient world and across the centuries, the most consequential advances in architecture, engineering, and monumental construction have been achieved not by builders who got it right the first time, but by builders who got it wrong, learned from the failure, and tried again. The record of these failures is usually invisible, erased by the subsequent success that makes the failure seem unnecessary in retrospect. At Dahshur, the record is preserved in stone, and its preservation transforms our understanding of how civilizations actually achieve the things that define them. The first parallel worth examining comes from the Roman world, from the development of the concrete dome, the engineering innovation that produced some of the most spectacular interior spaces in the history of architecture. The Pantheon in Rome, completed around 125 AD during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, is crowned by an unreinforced concrete dome that spans approximately 43 meters, a diameter that was not exceeded for more than 1,300 years. The dome is a masterpiece of engineering, its weight distributed through a series of graduated rings of concrete that decrease in density from the base, where heavy basalt aggregate is used, to the oculus at the summit, where lightweight pumice aggregate reduces the load. The result is a self-supporting shell of extraordinary elegance that has stood without structural reinforcement for nearly 1900 years. But the Pantheon was not Hadrian's first attempt. The original Pantheon, built by Marcus Agrippa in the late 1st century BC, was a conventional rectangular temple that burned down and was rebuilt at least once before Hadrian's architects redesigned it with the revolutionary domed rotunda. The engineering knowledge needed to build the dome was developed through decades of experimentation with concrete vaulting in smaller structures, bathhouses, market halls, and palace reception rooms, where the consequences of structural failure were less dramatic and less politically damaging than they would have been in a major public monument. The Pantheon dome was not invented. It was evolved through a process of progressive experimentation that was, in its essential methodology, identical to Sneferu's process at Dahshur. The smaller structures were the Meidums and the bent pyramids. The Pantheon was the Red Pyramid. The final triumph was built on a foundation of preliminary failures that are now mostly forgotten. The Gothic cathedral provides another parallel that is particularly instructive, because the failures, unlike those of Roman concrete construction, are still visible. The development of the Gothic structural system, the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress, was a process of progressive experimentation that produced some of the most spectacular structural failures in the history of European architecture. The Cathedral of Beauvais, in northern France, represents the most dramatic of these failures. The builders of Beauvais attempted to push the Gothic structural system to its absolute limit, constructing a choir vault that rose to a height of roughly 48 meters, the tallest Gothic vault ever attempted. In 1284, the vault collapsed. The builders rebuilt it, adding additional supports and reducing the span. The rebuilt vault survived, but the cathedral was never completed. The transept and nave were never built. The Cathedral of Beauvais stands today as a magnificent fragment, the tallest Gothic choir in existence, surrounded by the absence of the building that was supposed to accompany it. It is, like the bent pyramid, a monument to the limits of ambition, a structure that pushed beyond what the available technology could reliably support, and that bears, in its physical fabric, the permanent record of the failure that resulted. The comparison between Beauvais and the Bent Pyramid is illuminating because both monuments embody the same fundamental tension between ambition and structural reality. The builders of Beauvais, like Sneferu's builders, were pushing beyond the known limits of their technology. They were building higher, spanning wider, and loading their structures more heavily than anyone had done before. And when the structures failed, when the vault collapsed at Beauvais and the angle changed at Dahshur, the builders in both cases responded with adaptations that were pragmatic rather than ideal. They did not abandon their projects. They modified them. They accepted compromises that preserved what could be preserved and that produced monuments that were less than what had been envisioned, but more than what would have existed if the builders had lacked the courage to attempt the impossible in the first place. The Italian architect Filippo Brunelleschi faced a similar challenge in the 15th century when he undertook to complete the dome of the Cathedral of Florence, the Santa Maria del Fiore. The cathedral had been under construction for more than a century when Brunelleschi was awarded the commission, and the builders had left an octagonal opening at the crossing that was roughly 42 meters in diameter, far too wide to be spanned by conventional Gothic vaulting, and too large for the construction of the temporary wooden centering that was normally used to support a dome during construction. Brunelleschi solved the problem by inventing a double-shelled dome that was self-supporting during construction, using a herringbone pattern of brickwork that locked each course into the one below it, and that allowed the dome to rise without the need for centering. The Dome of Florence was a triumph of innovative engineering, and it was achieved through a process of experimentation and improvisation that Sneferu would have recognized immediately. Brunelleschi built models, he tested materials, he devised new construction techniques on the fly, adapting his methods as unexpected problems arose during the building process. The Dome of Florence is not the product of a single, comprehensive design that was worked out in advance and executed without deviation. It is the product of a creative process in which the design evolved during construction, in which problems were solved as they emerged, and in which the final form of the monument was determined not by the architect's original vision alone, but by the dialogue between that vision and the physical realities of stone, brick, mortar, and gravity. The parallel extends to the ancient Near East, where the construction of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople between 532 and 537 AD represents another case of monumental architecture achieved through what might be called productive failure. The original dome of the Hagia Sophia, designed by the mathematicians Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, was a shallow, broad dome that collapsed in 558 AD, probably due to earthquake damage combined with the lateral thrust that the dome exerted on its supporting arches. The dome was rebuilt by Isidore the Younger, the nephew of the original architect, using a steeper profile that reduced the lateral thrust and that has survived, with repairs, for nearly 1,500 years. The rebuilt dome is taller and less elegant than the original, and it was not what the original architects intended, but it stands. It has endured, and the failure that produced it, the collapse of the first dome, was the event that generated the engineering knowledge needed to build a dome that would last. The Maya civilization provides yet another parallel, one drawn from a completely independent architectural tradition that arrived at similar solutions through similar processes of experimentation and failure. The Maya builders of the classic period constructed corbelled vaults of stone that spanned the interior spaces of their temple and palace buildings, creating narrow, high-ceilinged rooms that were the defining interior spaces of Maya architecture. The corbelled vault, like the Egyptian corbelled ceiling that Sneferu's builders used in the Red Pyramid, is a self-supporting structure in which each course of stone projects slightly inward from the one below it, creating an arch that carries its own weight without the need for centering or formwork. The Maya developed this technique over centuries, progressively widening the spans and increasing the heights of their vaulted rooms pushing the technique to its structural limits through a process of trial and error that produced occasional failures, collapsed vaults and abandoned buildings, alongside the spectacular successes that still stand in the jungles of Guatemala and Mexico. The cobbled vault at Tikal's Temple of the Giant Jaguar, spanning roughly 3 meters at a height of roughly 12 meters, represents one of the most ambitious applications of the technique, and its construction was informed by centuries of accumulated experience with smaller vaults in less prominent buildings. The pattern that emerges from these diverse examples, Egyptian, Roman, Gothic, Renaissance, Byzantine, Maya, is remarkably consistent. In every case, the breakthrough in monumental architecture was achieved not through theoretical perfection, but through practical experimentation, through the willingness to build structures that might fail and to learn from the failures that resulted. The bent pyramid is the purest surviving example of this process because it preserves the failure and the adaptation in a single monument, making visible what is usually invisible, documenting the creative process in the physical fabric of the structure itself. The other examples, the Pantheon, the Gothic cathedrals, the Dome of Florence, the Hagia Sophia, have been filtered by time and by subsequent construction. The preliminary failures have been demolished, rebuilt, or obscured by later modifications. At Dahshur, the failure is still standing, still bearing its original casing, still showing the world exactly what happened when the builders of the first true pyramid encountered a problem they had not anticipated and chose adaptation over catastrophe. The Middle Kingdom return to Dahshur adds another chapter to the site's story of experimentation and failure because the 12th Dynasty builders, who chose to build their pyramids on the same plateau as Sneferu's monuments, encountered their own versions of the structural problems that had plagued their predecessor. Amenemhat III, the most powerful king of the 12th Dynasty, built his first pyramid at Dahshur, a mudbrick monument with a limestone casing that incorporated one of the most complex subterranean burial systems of the entire Middle Kingdom. The substructure included a quartzite burial chamber, an elaborate anti-robbery system of portcullis blocks and false passages, and a series of interconnected corridors that were designed to mislead intruders. But the pyramid developed serious structural problems, probably related to the pressure of the superstructure on the clay-rich subsoil beneath the foundation. The burial chamber began to shift. Cracks appeared in the walls. The ceiling showed signs of dangerous movement. Amenemhat III abandoned the Dahshur pyramid and built a second pyramid at Hawara, in the Fayum, where the geological conditions were more favourable. The parallel between Amenemhat III's experience at Dahshur and Sneferu's experience more than 700 years earlier is almost uncanny. In both cases, a powerful king began a major pyramid project at Dahshur. In both cases, the project encountered structural problems that threatened the integrity of the monument. In both cases, the king responded by building a second pyramid at a different site, incorporating the lessons learned from the first failure into the design of the replacement. Dahshur, it seems, is a site that teaches builders humility, a place where the ambitions of kings encounter the physical limits of stone and soil and gravity, and where the response to those limits has, in every case, been not retreat but adaptation, not surrender but redirection, not the abandonment of the goal but the modification of the method. The Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III, as the Dahshur monument is now known, stands at the southern end of the pyramid field as a dark, eroded mass of mudbrick that looks nothing like the gleaming white monument it once was. Its casing stones have been stripped away, its mudbrick core has been dissolved by centuries of rain and wind, and its original geometric form is entirely lost. But its substructure survives in relatively good condition, and the quartzite burial chamber, although it was never used for the king's burial, remains one of the finest examples of Middle Kingdom stoneworking. The Princess At was buried there, and her grave goods, including a set of gold and semi-precious stone jewellery that is now among the treasures of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, testify to the wealth and artistic sophistication of the late 12th Dynasty court. The modern world has its own Dahshur, its own sites where the experimental development of new technologies has been accompanied by failures that were as essential to the eventual success as the success itself. The development of early aviation has already been mentioned, but the parallel extends well beyond the Wright brothers. The entire history of rocket propulsion is a history of productive failure. Robert Goddard's early rockets, tested in the fields of Massachusetts and the deserts of New Mexico in the 1920s and 30s, were plagued by explosions, misfires, and structural failures that would have discouraged any builder less persistent than Sneferu himself. Goddard's contemporary, the German-Romanian physicist Hermann Oberth, published theoretical work on rocket propulsion that was widely dismissed by the scientific establishment of his time. The V-2 rocket program of the Second World War, directed by Wernher von Braun, experienced hundreds of test failures before producing a reliable weapon, and the American and Soviet space programs of the 1950s and 60s, working with technologies that were barely understood and materials that were inadequately tested, experienced catastrophic failures that killed technicians, destroyed equipment, and, on several occasions, threatened the political viability of the entire enterprise. In every case, the failures were not mere obstacles to be overcome. They were the mechanism through which the knowledge needed for success was generated. Each failure revealed a parameter that the engineers had not adequately understood. Each explosion identified a weakness in the design. Each structural breakdown provided data that could not have been obtained in any other way. The process was expensive, dangerous, and politically difficult, but it was also, in a fundamental sense, necessary. The knowledge of how to build a reliable rocket was encoded not in the textbooks, but in the failure reports, not in the theoretical models, but in the wreckage of the tests that went wrong. The Bent Pyramid is the oldest surviving failure report in the history of engineering, a monument-sized record of a structural crisis that generated the knowledge needed to build the most famous structure on Earth. The numbers are striking across these comparisons. Sneferu built 3 pyramids in roughly 24 years, each one incorporating the lessons of the previous failure. The Gothic builders took roughly 2 centuries to develop the structural system, from the early experiments at Saint-Denis to the ambitious but unsuccessful attempt at Beauvais. The Roman concrete dome evolved over roughly a century and a half, from the early experiments of the late Republic to the perfect form of the Pantheon. Brunelleschi's dome took roughly 16 years from commission to completion, but it drew on a lifetime of study and experimentation that began decades before the construction started. The pattern varies in timescale, but not in structure. In every case, the final achievement was the product of a process of iterative refinement, and the process required failures that were as costly, as visible, and as politically embarrassing as the Bent Pyramid's angle change. The Red Pyramid itself deserves a chapter of its own in this narrative, because it represents not merely a successful experiment, but the moment when experimentation ended and certainty began. When Sneferu's builders laid the foundation of the Red Pyramid at the consistent angle of 43 degrees, they were not guessing. They were applying knowledge that had been earned through the structural crises at Meidum and the Bent Pyramid. Knowledge that had cost years of labour, millions of tons of stone, and the visible humiliation of producing a monument with a broken profile. The 43-degree angle was not arbitrary. It was the angle at which the Bent Pyramid's upper section had been built after the emergency correction, and it was the angle that had proved structurally stable even under the enormous loads of the upper courses. The Red Pyramid's builders took the lesson of the Bent Pyramid's successful upper section and applied it from the bottom up, creating a monument that was, from its first course to its last, based on demonstrated engineering success rather than theoretical aspiration. The result was a pyramid that is, in many respects, more impressive than the Great Pyramid itself. This is a claim that requires explanation, because the Great Pyramid is larger, taller, and more precisely constructed than the Red Pyramid. But the Red Pyramid was built first. It was the prototype. It proved the concept. It demonstrated that a true pyramid could be built at scale, that the structural challenges could be managed, that the logistics could be sustained, and that the theological requirements could be met. The Great Pyramid is the refinement, the Red Pyramid is the invention. And in the hierarchy of human achievement, the invention is always more consequential than the refinement. Because without the invention, the refinement would never have been possible. The interior of the Red Pyramid reinforces this assessment. The three corbelled chambers, reached by the long descending passage from the northern face, represent the most sophisticated internal architecture of any pyramid built before the Great Pyramid. The corbelling technique, in which each course of stone projects slightly inward from the one below, creating a self-supporting arch that narrows to a point at the ceiling, was a direct response to the structural failures observed in the bent pyramid's chambers, where the ceiling blocks had shifted and cracked under the weight of the pyramid above. The Red Pyramid's corbelled ceilings are stable, precisely built, and architecturally stunning, rising to heights of 12 and 15 meters in the two lower chambers. The technique would be adopted and perfected by Khufu's builders in the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid, where the corbelling extends for 47 meters along a steeply inclined passage, creating one of the most dramatic interior spaces in the ancient world. But the Grand Gallery's corbelling was not an invention. It was an elaboration of the technique that Sneferu's builders had pioneered in the Red Pyramid's chambers, a technique that was itself a response to the failures that had been observed in the bent pyramid's inferior chambers. The Pyramid of Senusret III at Dahshur, built roughly 700 years after Sneferu's monuments, provides an instructive contrast that illuminates the changing nature of the pyramid tradition over time. Senusret III was one of the most powerful kings of the Middle Kingdom, a warrior who campaigned deep into Nubia and who was worshipped as a god in the region for centuries after his death. His pyramid at Dahshur, with a base length of roughly 105 meters, is the largest of the Middle Kingdom pyramids, but its construction technique is fundamentally different from Sneferu's. The core is mud brick rather than stone, and the subterranean chambers, while architecturally sophisticated, rely on concealment and misdirection, rather than on the massive structural engineering that characterizes Sneferu's monuments. The evolution from Sneferu to Senusret III is the evolution from engineering courage to administrative cunning, from the willingness to fail publicly in stone to the determination to hide privately behind deception. The contrast extends to the burial equipment. Senusret III's subterranean complex at Dahshur is one of the most elaborate anti-robbery systems in the entire pyramid tradition, with blind passages, false floors, hidden shafts, and a granite-lined burial chamber that was designed to be virtually impregnable. The British archaeologist Jacques de Morgan, who excavated the complex in the 1890s, described the substructure as a maze, a labyrinth of stone and deception that was as architecturally complex in its own way as the bent pyramid, but that was designed to confuse rather than to impress, to hide rather than to display, to frustrate rather than to inspire. De Morgan also discovered, in the tombs of the princesses adjacent to Senusret's pyramid, some of the finest jewellery ever found in Egypt, delicate confections of gold, carnelian, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and amethyst that are among the supreme achievements of the goldsmith's art, and that now occupy pride of place in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The discovery of the princess's jewellery at Dahshur is a reminder that the site's archaeological richness extends far beyond the pyramids themselves. The necropolis contains the tombs of royal family members, court officials, and priestly personnel, spanning more than a millennium of Egyptian history, and the artifacts recovered from these tombs include some of the most important and most beautiful objects in the entire Egyptian archaeological record. The Dahshur treasure, as De Morgan's jewellery finds are collectively known, transformed the understanding of Middle Kingdom craftsmanship and demonstrated that the artistic achievements of the 12th Dynasty rivaled, and in some respects surpassed those of the more famous New Kingdom. The jewellery of the princesses Sithatho, Mereret, and Knumet, with their intricate cloison work and their mastery of granulation, are works of art that stand comparison with anything produced by the jewellers of Tutankhamun's court, and they were produced roughly 400 years earlier. The loss of the limestone casings from the Dahshur pyramids the Great Pyramid, and virtually every other major pyramid in the Nile Valley, is one of the great underappreciated catastrophes of archaeological history, and the bent pyramid's preserved casing makes the scale of the loss painfully clear. When the bent pyramid's surviving casing catches the afternoon sun, the polished limestone surfaces flash with a brilliance that seems almost artificial, a sharp white glare that stands out against the tawny desert with an intensity that no photograph can fully capture. This is what every pyramid in Egypt once looked like. The Great Pyramid was not the rough, brownish-yellow stepped mass that tourists photograph today. It was a gleaming white mountain of polished stone that reflected the sun's light across the Nile Valley for tens of kilometers. The Pyramid of Khafre was not the dual-toned monument, rough stone below and smooth casing above, that appears in every postcard. It was a continuous sheet of white limestone from base to summit, identical in surface finish to its neighbour, and distinguished from it only by its slightly smaller size and its slightly higher elevation on the Giza plateau. The stripping of the casings was not a natural process. It was a deliberate, sustained, economically motivated campaign of architectural dismantlement that consumed the most impressive feature of the most impressive monuments in the ancient world. The casing stones of the Giza pyramids were quarried away primarily during the 14th century AD, when the Bari Mamluk Sultan Hassan ibn Muhammad ibn Qalawun used the stone to build the Sultan Hassan Mosque and Madrasa complex in Cairo, one of the finest examples of Islamic architecture in Egypt. The irony is bitter. One of the greatest achievements of medieval Islamic architecture was built, in part, from the dismantled casing of one of the greatest achievements of ancient Egyptian architecture. The stone was the same stone. The craftsmanship that cut it was the same craftsmanship. Only the context had changed. The blocks that had been cut and polished and fitted with millimeter precision by the builders of Khufu's pyramid were repurposed, recut, and incorporated into the walls of a monument that was, in its own way, equally magnificent. The pyramids fed the mosques, the ancient fed the medieval, and the visual record of what the pyramids originally looked like was erased from the landscape, surviving only at the bent pyramid, where the awkward shape and the structural instability of the lower section discouraged the quarriers and preserved the casing that every other major pyramid has lost. Rainer Stadelmann, the German archaeologist who directed the German Archaeological Institute's excavations at Dahshur for more than 2 decades, made the Red Pyramid the focus of his most sustained and most productive research program. Stadelmann's work at the Red Pyramid was characterized by a thoroughness and a precision that matched the standards of the monument's original builders. His team surveyed the entire pyramid with laser instruments, producing 3-dimensional models of the structure that revealed details of construction technique that had been invisible to previous investigators. They excavated the mortuary temple on the east face of the pyramid, recovering fragments of relief decoration that demonstrated the existence of an elaborate artistic program comparable to those of the later Fifth Dynasty temples. And they explored the interior of the pyramid with a systematic attention to detail that produced new insights into the construction sequence and the engineering decisions that shaped the monument. Stadelmann's most significant contribution was his argument that the Red Pyramid, rather than the Bent Pyramid, was Sneferu's intended burial place. This argument, based on the discovery of fragmentary human remains in the upper chamber of the Red Pyramid, and on architectural analysis, suggesting that the upper chamber was designed as a burial chamber rather than a subsidiary room, resolved a long-standing debate about Sneferu's burial location and established the Red Pyramid as the culmination rather than the supplement of Sneferu's building program. If Stadelmann is correct, and his argument has been widely accepted, then the Red Pyramid is not merely the first true pyramid. It is the tomb of the inventor of the true pyramid, the final resting place of the most consequential builder in Egyptian history, the monument that closes the circle of experimentation that began at Meidum and that passed through the crisis of the bent pyramid on its way to the confidence and the clarity of the 43-degree angle, the modern concept of design thinking, a methodology that has been influential in business, engineering, and product development since the early 21st century, formalizes the iterative process that Sneferu practiced instinctively more than 4,500 years ago. Design thinking, as articulated by practitioners at institutions like the Stanford Design School and the design firm EDO, is a structured approach to problem solving that emphasizes prototyping, testing, failing, and iterating. The methodology explicitly embraces failure as a source of knowledge. It treats the first attempt not as the final product, but as a prototype, a test version that exists to be evaluated, criticized, and improved. The designer is expected to fail. The failure is not a setback, it is data, and the data generated by the failure is used to refine the next iteration, which is itself a prototype, subject to the same process of evaluation, criticism, and improvement. Sneferu would have understood this methodology immediately. Meidum was his first prototype. The bent pyramid was his second prototype, revised in real time when the test revealed a structural flaw. The red pyramid was his final product, incorporating all the knowledge gained from the two previous iterations. The process is identical, the scale is different, the materials are different, the cultural context is different, but the underlying logic, the logic of iterative refinement through productive failure, is the same. The bent pyramid is the oldest surviving prototype in the history of engineering, a monument that documents the entire creative design process in its own physical and structural fabric, and that proved, with the indisputable authority of 4.5 millennia of unbroken structural endurance, that the process works and that the courage to fail is the foundation of every lasting achievement. There is a dimension of the Dahshur story that most architectural analyses overlook because it concerns not the monuments themselves, but the people who built them, the forgotten labourers whose names survive only in the graffiti they scratched on the backs of limestone blocks that were never intended to be seen. The friends of Sneferu and the drunkards of Sneferu are not mere labels. They are identities, self-chosen designations that reveal how the workers understood their relationship to the king and to the project they were building. The word friends is particularly significant because it implies a reciprocal relationship, a bond of mutual obligation between the king and his workforce that went beyond the simple exercise of royal authority. Sneferu, in the memory preserved by these graffiti, was not merely a commander. He was a patron, a figure to whom the workers felt a personal connection strong enough to encode in the stone of the monument itself. The Palermo stone corroborates this picture of Sneferu as a king who was personally engaged with his subjects. The surviving entries describe a ruler of expansive generosity, a king who distributed gifts, founded towns, and undertook military campaigns that brought plunder and captives back to Egypt. Later Egyptian tradition remembered Sneferu as a benevolent ruler, a king whose reign was looked back upon as a golden age of prosperity and good governance. The Middle Kingdom literary text, known as the Story of King Cheops and the Magicians, depicts Sneferu as an approachable, good-humoured monarch who enjoys jokes and entertainment and who treats his courtiers with casual familiarity. Whether this literary portrait reflects historical reality or idealized nostalgia is impossible to determine, but the consistency between the literary tradition and the archaeological evidence, the graffiti, the Palermo stone entries, the scale and quality of the building program, suggests that Sneferu was, by the standards of his time, an exceptional ruler, a king who combined extraordinary ambition with a capacity for delegation and collaboration that made the pyramid program possible. The landscape of Dahshur as it exists today is itself a document that rewards careful reading. Stand on the desert plateau between the two pyramids, with the bent pyramid to the south and the red pyramid to the north, and you are standing in the space between the question and the answer, between the experiment and the result, between the failure and the success. The 2 kilometers of empty desert that separate the two monuments are not merely geographical distance. They are chronological distance. The distance between the moment when the builders realized that the bent pyramid's angle had to change, and the moment when the first course of the red pyramid was laid at the angle that would prove to be correct. Walk that distance from south to north, from the bent pyramid to the red pyramid, and you are walking through the most consequential period of architectural experimentation in human history. You are crossing the gap between not knowing and knowing, between hoping and proving, between the courage to attempt and the satisfaction of achievement. To the south, beyond the bent pyramid, the Middle Kingdom pyramids cluster along the edge of the escarpment, their mud brick cores eroded into dark, shapeless mounds that mark the later trajectory of the pyramid tradition. The Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III looms like a ruined hill, its geometry dissolved, its purpose forgotten by all but the specialists who study it. Further south still, the Pyramid of Senusret III stands in somewhat better condition, its limestone casing partially preserved on the lower courses, its subterranean chambers still accessible though heavily damaged by tomb robbers. Together, these Middle Kingdom monuments extend the chronological range of the Dahshur pyramid field across more than 7 centuries, from the invention of the true pyramid under Sneferu to the institutional maturity and physical compromise of the 12th Dynasty. The landscape is a timeline, a geological cross-section of the pyramid tradition, and walking from one end to the other is like reading a book about the rise and decline of a civilization's most defining practice. The Dahshur pyramid field contains one more element that deserves attention, and it is an element that is invisible from the surface. Beneath the desert sand, between and around the visible monuments, there are tombs, shafts, processional ways, and architectural foundations that have not yet been excavated, and that may contain discoveries as significant as anything that has already been found. The Czech Institute of Egyptology, the German Archaeological Institute, and the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities have all conducted surveys that indicate the presence of extensive subsurface remains that await future investigation. The site is far from exhausted. The story of Dahshur is still being written, one excavation season at a time, and the possibility that major new discoveries remain to be made gives the site an air of anticipation that distinguishes it from more thoroughly excavated sites like Giza and Saqqara. But the most important thing that remains to be discovered at Dahshur may not be an artifact or a tomb or a papyrus. It may be a new way of understanding the relationship between failure and achievement, a new appreciation for the courage that failure requires, and the knowledge that failure generates. The bent pyramid is the most visible monument to that courage that the ancient world has produced. It stands in the desert, imperfect and enduring, its casing gleaming in the sun, its broken profile testifying to a moment of crisis that became a moment of invention. The builders who changed the angle did not know that they were inventing the true pyramid. They did not understand the full significance of what they were doing. They thought they were saving a failing monument from catastrophic collapse. They were doing both, simultaneously, in a single act of engineering improvisation that had consequences extending far beyond anything they could have imagined. And the knowledge that they generated, the knowledge that lived in their hands, and their eyes, and their understanding of stone and gravity, and the limits of human ambition, was the knowledge that made the Great Pyramid possible, that made the Giza Plateau possible, that made the entire 4,000-year legacy of the Egyptian pyramid tradition possible. The failure was the foundation, and the foundation, like the pyramid it supported, has endured. Each of these vanished or transformed traditions of experimental architecture shares, with Dahshur, a common pattern that transcends the specific cultural, geographical, and chronological contexts of the individual cases. In every case, the breakthrough came through failure. In every case, the knowledge needed for success was generated by the experience of failure. In every case, the willingness to fail publicly, to produce monuments that were imperfect, incomplete, or structurally compromised, was the prerequisite for the eventual production of monuments that were successful, complete, and structurally sound. And in every case, the failures have been undervalued by subsequent generations that see only the success, and that attribute the success to genius, to divine inspiration, or to natural talent, rather than to the painful, expensive, politically embarrassing process of trial and error that actually produced it. The undervaluation of failure is itself a pattern that the Dahshur evidence allows us to examine with unusual clarity. Sneferu built more pyramid than any other pharaoh. He moved more stone, employed more workers, consumed more resources, and made more engineering decisions than any other builder in Egyptian history, and he is virtually unknown to the modern public, while his son Khufu, who built a single pyramid using engineering principles that Sneferu developed, is one of the most famous people in ancient history. The inventor is forgotten, the perfecter is remembered. The person who did the hard, uncertain, failure-prone work of developing a new form is overlooked in favor of the person who applied the developed form with confidence and precision. This is not merely an injustice to Sneferu. It is a systematic bias in how human cultures remember and reward achievement. A bias that consistently favors the polished final product over the messy process that produced it, and that consistently undervalues the people whose willingness to fail made the success possible. The consequences of this bias extend far beyond questions of historical reputation. When a culture systematically undervalues failure, it systematically discourages the kind of experimentation that failure requires. If the builders of the bent pyramid had been punished for the angle change, if the structural compromise had been treated as an unforgivable incompetence, rather than as a necessary adaptation, Sneferu would never have attempted the Red Pyramid, and the true pyramid form would never have been invented. The tolerance for failure is not a luxury that successful civilizations can comfortably afford to dispense with once they have achieved a baseline of competence and stability. It is the essential precondition for the kind of sustained innovation that makes civilizations successful in the first place, and that keeps them successful across the generations. And the loss of that tolerance, the transition from a culture that embraces experimentation to a culture that demands certainty, is one of the most reliable indicators of civilizational stagnation. The late Old Kingdom, the very period that produced the rubble-filled pyramids of Abu Sir and the diminishing monuments of the Sixth Dynasty, was precisely such a culture of demanded certainty. The builders of the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties did not experiment, they replicated. They built their pyramids according to established templates, using proven techniques at conventional angles with standardized plans. The experimentation that had characterized Sneferu's reign was replaced by a conservatism that valued reliability over innovation and that treated deviation from the established pattern as a risk to be avoided rather than an opportunity to be embraced. The rubble-filled cores of the Abusir pyramids were not the result of failed experimentation. They were the result of the absence of experimentation, of a building culture that had stopped pushing the limits of what was possible and had settled for what was safe. The courage that had produced the bent pyramid and the red pyramid was gone. In its place was a bureaucratic efficiency that maintained the forms of the tradition while quietly hollowing out its substance. The forgotten ones who built the Dahshur pyramids, the quarrymen and the masons, and the haulers and the overseers and the architects and the scribes deserve to be remembered not because they produced perfect monuments, but because they did not. They produced the bent pyramid, a monument that shows the world what the creative process actually looks like when it is happening in real time, when the outcome is uncertain, when the builders are working without a net, when the possibility of catastrophic failure is real and present and visible in every crack, in every ceiling beam. They produced something that no subsequent generation of Egyptian builders ever produced again, a monument of genuine innovation, a structure that embodied the willingness to attempt the unknown, and the courage to adapt when the unknown turned out to be more difficult than anticipated. That willingness, that courage, that tolerance for imperfection in the service of discovery is the rarest and most valuable quality that any civilization can possess. And the bent pyramid, standing in the desert with its broken profile and its gleaming casing and its 4,500 years of structural endurance, is its most permanent and most eloquent monument. There is a moment, late at night, when the architectural analysis falls away and the human reality of what happened at Dahshur comes into focus. It stops being about angles and load distributions and corbelled ceilings. It starts being about people, about the men who stood inside a cracking chamber and decided to change the angle, about the king who watched his monument deviate from the theological ideal and accepted the compromise, about the workers who scratched their team names on the backs of blocks that would be buried inside a pyramid and that no one would see for 4,500 years, about the hands that polished the casing stones to a brightness that turned a pile of rock into a machine for catching light, about the knowledge that lived in those hands, knowledge that had been accumulated through decades of practice, and that would be lost irrecoverably when the last person who possessed it failed to pass it on. The deeper truth of Dahshur is not about pyramids. It is about the nature of courage, about the specific kind of courage that is required to attempt something that has never been done before, knowing that failure is not merely possible but likely, knowing that the failure will be visible to everyone, knowing that the monument you build may stand for thousands of years as a record of your mistake. This is not the courage of the warrior who risks death in a moment of crisis. This is the courage of the builder who risks humiliation over a lifetime of work, who invests years of effort in a project whose outcome is uncertain, and who must live with the result, whether it is a triumph or a catastrophe, for the rest of his life and for all of recorded history afterward. Sneferu possessed this courage in a measure that is almost impossible to comprehend from the comfortable distance of 4.5 millennia. He built 3 pyramids. The first failed. The second encountered a structural crisis that forced a visible, permanent, humiliating compromise. The third succeeded, and at every stage, at every moment of crisis, at every point where a lesser king might have abandoned the project or scaled back the ambition, or retreated to the safety of the established stepped pyramid form, Sneferu kept building, he kept trying, he kept pushing against the limits of what stone and gravity and human organizational capacity would permit. The bent pyramid's angle change was not a retreat. It was an adaptation, a mid-course correction that preserved the project and that generated the knowledge needed for the next attempt. The Red Pyramid was not a consolation prize. It was the vindication of the entire program, the proof that the failures had been productive, that the knowledge gained from the crises had been worth the cost in stone and labor and royal prestige. Let that sink in. The most consequential engineering program in the history of human civilization was conducted by a man who failed twice before he succeeded once. The form that has defined Egypt in the human imagination for 4,000 years, the smooth-sided true pyramid, was invented by a king who built a collapsed pyramid at Meidum and a bent pyramid at Dahshur before he built the first true pyramid anywhere on Earth. The failures were not incidental to the achievement. They were constitutive of it. Without the failures, the achievement would not have been possible. The knowledge that made the Red Pyramid possible was generated by the crises that made the bent pyramid necessary, and the knowledge that made the Great Pyramid possible was generated by the entire sequence of experiments, failures, adaptations, and refinements that Sneferu's building program represented. This is not science fiction. This is the documented reality of how the most recognizable architectural form in human history came into existence. And the question it forces us to ask is whether we, in the modern world, possess the same courage, whether our civilization is willing to fail publicly, to produce visible, permanent, unmistakable records of our mistakes, in the pursuit of achievements that have not yet been imagined. The evidence from multiple domains of contemporary life suggests that the answer is increasingly no. The modern world has developed an extraordinary, perhaps unprecedented, intolerance for failure. The political cost of a failed public project, the reputational cost of a visible engineering mistake, the legal cost of a structural problem, the media cost of any deviation from the expected outcome, all of these have risen to levels that make the kind of experimental boldness that characterized Sneferu's building program virtually impossible in the contemporary environment. We do not build bent pyramids anymore. We build projects that have been analyzed, modeled, reviewed, approved, insured, and certified to eliminate the possibility of failure before the first stone is laid. And the cost of this elimination, the cost of guaranteed perfection, is the loss of the experimental courage that made the great breakthroughs of the past possible. We assume that what we build will outlast us. The ruins suggest otherwise. Every monument is a bet against time, and time has never lost. But the specific lesson of Dahshur goes beyond the generic observation that all things decay. The Dahshur lesson is about creation, about the conditions under which genuinely new things come into existence, and about the price that must be paid, in failure, in humiliation, in visible imperfection, for the privilege of producing something that has never existed before. Let that sink in. The bent pyramid has stood for more than 4,500 years. It has outlasted every building constructed in the 2 centuries before it, and most of the buildings constructed in the 2 centuries after it. It has survived earthquakes, sandstorms, tomb robbers, and the slow erosion of wind and rain. It is one of the most enduring structures on the surface of the earth, and it is, by any conventional standard of architectural perfection, a failure. Its profile is broken, its proportions are wrong, its geometry is a compromise. It is the most successful failure in the history of human construction, a monument that proves, with the authority of 45 centuries of continuous existence, that imperfection is compatible with endurance, that compromise is compatible with greatness, and that the willingness to produce something imperfect is the precondition for producing anything at all. The people who polished the casing stones of the bent pyramid possessed a form of knowledge that is worth mourning, not because it is dramatic or exotic, but because it is specific, because it cannot be recovered, and because its loss diminishes the total inventory of human capability in a way that is permanent and irreversible. The ability to polish limestone to a mirror finish, to coax the stone into releasing its internal luminosity, to transform a rough-cut block into a surface that catches the sun and throws it back across the desert. This was a skill that existed in the hands and eyes and reflexes of individual craftsmen who learned it through years of apprenticeship under the supervision of masters who had themselves learned it through years of apprenticeship under the supervision of their own masters. The chain of transmission stretched back through generations of stone polishers to the earliest experiments with dressed limestone at Saqqara and beyond. And that chain has been broken. No living person possesses the specific knowledge needed to polish a limestone casing stone to the finish that the bent pyramid's surviving casing displays. The knowledge was embodied. It lived in human bodies. When the last body that contained it died, the knowledge died with it, and no amount of study, no amount of experimentation, no amount of scholarly analysis of the surviving surfaces can fully reconstruct what was lost. The loss of craft knowledge is one of the most insidious and most poorly understood forms of civilizational decline, because it is invisible while it is happening and irreversible once it has occurred. A civilization does not know that it is losing the ability to polish limestone until the last stone polisher retires and no apprentice takes his place. It does not know that it is losing the ability to build solid stone pyramids until a king orders a pyramid and the builders fill the core with rubble because they no longer know how to lay precisely dimensioned courses of solid stone. It does not know that it is losing the ability to design self-supporting arches until an architect orders an arch and the builders construct something that requires temporary support, external reinforcement, or material substitution to stay standing. Each loss is individually small, a single skill, a single technique, a single way of working with a specific material under specific conditions. But the losses accumulate, they compound, they interact, and the cumulative effect is a civilization that can no longer do what it once did, not because it lacks the will or the resources, but because it lacks the specific, embodied, transmittable knowledge that made the achievement possible in the first place. The modern world is not immune to this process. The American space program provides a vivid example. The Saturn V rocket, which carried the Apollo missions to the moon between 1969 and 1972, was one of the most complex machines ever built. It contained roughly 3 million individual parts. It was assembled by a workforce of more than 400,000 people distributed across thousands of contractors and subcontractors. And the specific knowledge needed to build it, the knowledge of how individual components were manufactured, how they were tested, how they were assembled, how they interacted with each other under the extreme conditions of spaceflight, was distributed across that workforce in a way that was never fully documented and that could not be reconstructed from the documentation that does exist. When the Apollo program ended and the Saturn V production line was shut down, the specific knowledge needed to build the rocket began to disperse. The engineers retired. The technicians moved to other jobs. The contractors closed their specialized production lines. And within a generation, the ability to build the Saturn V was lost. Not because the blueprints were destroyed, but because the embodied knowledge that supplemented the blueprints, the practical know-how that told the workers how to interpret the drawings and how to handle the materials and how to solve the problems that the drawings did not anticipate, was gone. The connection to Dahshur is direct and unsettling. The knowledge that Sneferu's builders accumulated through their experimental program, the knowledge of how stone behaves under enormous loads, how angles affect structural stability, how corbelled ceilings distribute weight, how casing stones must be cut and fitted to maintain their bond with the core, was embodied knowledge of exactly the same kind. It lived in the hands and eyes and reflexes of the workers who gained it through years of practice. It was transmitted through apprenticeship and on-the-job training, and it was lost over the centuries that followed through the same process of institutional neglect and generational discontinuity that consumed the Saturn V's production knowledge. The pyramids got smaller, the cores filled with rubble, the knowledge dispersed, and the civilization that had invented the true pyramid through the courageous, expensive, politically risky process of trial and error at Dahshur was eventually unable to build one at all. The grief moment of the Dahshur story is not the angle change, it is not the structural crisis. It is not the cracking ceilings or the cedar log repairs or the visible compromise of the bent pyramid's profile. The grief is in the forgetting. The grief is that the man who invented the true pyramid, who moved more stone than any other human being in history, who transformed the skyline of Egypt through 3 decades of relentless, courageous, failure-rich experimentation, is virtually unknown to the modern world. Khufu is famous, Sneferu is not. The Great Pyramid is iconic, the Bent Pyramid is obscure. The monument that represents the finished product is celebrated. The monuments that represent the creative process, the messy, uncertain, failure-prone process that made the finished product possible, are ignored. This is not merely an injustice to Sneferu. It is a distortion of reality that has consequences for how we understand the nature of human achievement. When we celebrate the Great Pyramid without acknowledging the Bent Pyramid, we create the impression that great achievements emerge fully formed, that genius produces perfection without intermediate steps, that the gap between the ordinary and the extraordinary is crossed in a single leap rather than in a series of stumbling, uncertain, failure-prone experiments. This impression is false. It is always false. Every great achievement in every field of human endeavor has been preceded by failures that were as essential to the final result as the result itself. The theory of evolution was preceded by decades of confused and incorrect speculation about the mechanisms of biological change. The theory of relativity was preceded by years of failed attempts to explain the discrepancies in Newtonian mechanics. The development of the airplane was preceded by centuries of failed flying machines, from Leonardo's ornithopters to Langley's aerodrome, each one contributing a piece of the puzzle that the Wright brothers finally assembled at Kitty Hawk. The finished achievement is always the visible tip of an invisible mountain of failure, and when we celebrate the tip while ignoring the mountain, we misunderstand the process that produced it. The Bent Pyramid is the mountain made visible. It is the failure that is usually hidden, usually demolished, usually buried under the weight of the subsequent success. It stands in the desert sun, bearing its original casing, displaying its broken profile, telling the world what the creative process actually looks like when it is happening in real time, and the outcome is uncertain. It is, in this sense, the most valuable monument in Egypt, not because it is the most beautiful or the most impressive or the most technically accomplished, but because it is the most honest, the most revealing, the most unflinchingly truthful about the relationship between human ambition and physical reality. The philosopher Karl Popper argued that the progress of knowledge depends on the willingness to formulate hypotheses that can be tested and, if necessary, refuted. Science advances not by proving that its theories are correct, but by testing them against evidence and abandoning the ones that fail. The progress of knowledge is, in Popper's formulation, a process of error elimination, a systematic reduction of uncertainty through the identification and correction of mistakes. The bent pyramid is a Popperian monument. It is a hypothesis that was tested against the evidence of stone and gravity and found to be partially wrong. The angle was too steep. The hypothesis was corrected. The new angle was tested in the upper section of the bent pyramid and found to be right. The corrected hypothesis was applied from the ground up in the red pyramid and found to be definitively right. The process is identical to the scientific method. The only difference is the medium. Popper's scientists work with ideas and data. Sneferu's builders worked with limestone and gravity. The logic is the same. The desert wind blows across the Dahshur plateau. The bent pyramid catches the last light of the afternoon sun, its polished casing flashing white against the darkening sky. 2 kilometers to the north, the red pyramid stands in its shadow, reddish and massive and geometrically perfect. The world's first true pyramid, the proof that the experiment worked, the vindication of every failure that preceded it. Between them, the desert is empty, the sand is undisturbed, the silence is complete. And in that silence, in the space between the failure and the success, in the 2 kilometers of empty desert that separate the question from the answer, the entire story of human invention is written not in words but in stone, not in books but in monuments, not in the language of scholars but in the language of builders who worked with their hands and who left. In the limestone of Dahshur, the most permanent record of the creative process that the human species has ever produced. The casing of the bent pyramid will eventually erode. The polished surfaces that catch the sun today will roughen, crack, and crumble, as all stone surfaces eventually do, but the form will remain. The angle change will remain. The record of the crisis and the adaptation will remain, legible in the geometry of the monument, visible to anyone who stands at its base and looks up at the strange, broken, magnificent profile that has puzzled and inspired visitors for more than 45 centuries. The bent pyramid does not need its casing to tell its story. The story is in the shape, and the shape, unlike the surface, is permanent. It will last as long as the stone lasts. And the stone at Dahshur has already lasted longer than most civilizations. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the kind of knowledge that the Dahshur builders possessed. They called it sejmti, which is often translated as skill or craft, but which carries connotations that the English words do not fully capture. Sejmti implied not merely technical competence, but a deep, almost intuitive understanding of materials and processes that went beyond what could be taught through verbal instruction. A craftsman who possessed sejmti did not merely know how to work stone. He understood stone, felt its grain, anticipated its behavior, sensed the hairline fractures and the zones of weakness that would determine where a block would break and how a surface would respond to polishing. This knowledge was sacred. It was associated with the god Ptah, the patron of craftsmen, and it was transmitted through ritualized apprenticeship that treated the acquisition of craft knowledge as a spiritual discipline rather than a merely technical training. The loss of sejmti, the loss of this deep, embodied, spiritually grounded understanding of materials and processes was, for the ancient Egyptians, not merely an economic inconvenience. It was a spiritual diminishment, a reduction in the total stock of sacred knowledge that the civilization possessed. The modern world has lost the concept of sejmti. We have technical expertise. We have engineering knowledge. We have computer-aided design and material science and structural analysis software that can model the behavior of a building under any conceivable set of conditions. But we do not have sejmti, the deep, embodied, intuitive understanding of materials that comes only from years of hands-on work with those materials, under the supervision of masters who possess the understanding themselves. The loss of this concept, the loss of the very idea that craft knowledge has a spiritual dimension that cannot be reduced to data or algorithms or procedural manuals, is itself a form of civilizational loss that the ruins of Dahshur make painfully visible. The casing stones of the bent pyramid were polished by people who possessed sejmti. The stones gleam with a quality that modern stone working, for all its technological sophistication, has difficulty replicating. The knowledge is in the surface. The surface is still there, gleaming in the desert sun with a quality that 4.5 millennia of exposure have not fully diminished. The knowledge that created that surface is gone, dispersed into the air like smoke from an extinguished fire, irretrievable by any technology or any expenditure or any act of will. The casing stones endure as the memorial of a capability that the civilization that created them eventually lost, a capability that was as essential to the meaning of the pyramid as its geometry or its mass, and whose absence reduces every stripped pyramid in Egypt from a monument of light to a pile of rough stone that can only gesture at the brilliance it once possessed. The Dahshur Plateau at twilight is a place of extraordinary stillness. The tourist buses have not come. The cameras have not clicked. The guides have not recited their memorized scripts. The two pyramids stand in the failing light, one bright and one dark, one coist and one stripped, one imperfect and enduring, and one perfect and diminished, and the silence between them is the silence of a story that has been waiting 4,500 years for someone to understand it. The story is not about perfection. It is about the courage that precedes perfection, the willingness to produce something imperfect in the pursuit of something that has never existed before. The bent pyramid is that courage, frozen in limestone, preserved by the very imperfection that defined it, enduring because it failed, surviving because it was not worth quarrying, standing because no one wanted the stone that every other pyramid stone was wanted for. The failure saved it, the imperfection preserved it, and the monument that was supposed to be superseded stands today as the most complete, the most honest, and the most instructive pyramid in Egypt. Step back now from the limestone and the corbelled chambers and the angle changes and the craft knowledge and the graffiti, and look at the full arc of what has been described, because the story of Dahshur is not, in the end, a story about ancient Egypt alone. It is a story about the conditions under which genuine innovation occurs, about the price that innovation demands, and about the consequences of creating cultures that are unwilling to pay that price. We live in a world that celebrates innovation while systematically eliminating the conditions that make genuine innovation possible, that have always made genuine innovation possible, and that will always be required to make genuine innovation possible in the future. We praise creativity while punishing the failures that creativity requires. We demand breakthroughs while insisting on guaranteed outcomes. We want the red pyramid without the bent pyramid. We want the Great Pyramid without the Meidum collapse. We want the finished product without the messy, expensive, politically embarrassing process of trial and error that produced it. And the result, predictable and visible in every domain of contemporary life, is a world that is extraordinarily efficient at refining existing designs and extraordinarily poor at producing genuinely new ones. The modern construction industry provides a particularly stark and particularly well-documented illustration of this dynamic. Building codes, safety regulations, liability frameworks, and insurance requirements have made contemporary construction safer and more predictable than at any previous point in human history. A building constructed today is far less likely to collapse, to develop structural problems, or to fail in any catastrophic way than a building constructed at any previous time. But the same regulatory apparatus that has eliminated catastrophic failure has also eliminated the kind of experimental boldness that produced the bent pyramid, the Gothic cathedrals, the Dome of Florence, and the Pantheon. No modern builder could attempt what Sneferu attempted, not because modern builders lack the skill or the materials or the ambition, but because the regulatory barriers, the liability exposure, the insurance requirements, the environmental review processes, and the overwhelming political and reputational costs of visible structural failure would make any such attempt impossible before the first stone was quarried or the first foundation was poured. The system that protects us from catastrophic failure also protects us from transformative innovation, and the cost of that protection, measured in the stagnation of architectural ambition and the narrowing of design possibility, is a cost that the modern world has barely begun to assess. The pharmaceutical industry tells the same story in a different register, and the numbers illuminate the pattern with uncomfortable precision. The regulatory framework governing drug development has made modern medicines safer and more reliable than at any previous time in the history of pharmacology. The approval process ensures that no drug reaches the market without extensive testing across multiple phases of clinical trials, that side effects are identified, documented, and weighed against therapeutic benefits, and that the evidence of efficacy is demonstrated through rigorous, statistically powered studies that meet internationally recognized standards of scientific validity. But the same process that ensures safety also ensures that the development of a new drug takes an average of 10 to 15 years from initial discovery to market approval and costs. By recent estimates, more than $2 billion per successful drug, when the cost of the many failed candidates that never reach approval is factored into the calculation. The cost of eliminating failure from the pharmaceutical development process is the cost of pharmaceutical innovation itself. Each additional layer of regulatory protection makes approved drugs safer and makes the development of new drugs more expensive, more time-consuming, and less likely to be undertaken at all. The system is designed to prevent bad outcomes. It also prevents the kind of rapid, failure-rich experimentation that produced many of the most consequential medical breakthroughs of the past century, from penicillin to the polio vaccine to the early chemotherapy agents that were developed through processes of clinical experimentation that would be impossible under current regulatory frameworks. The parallel with Dahshur is not a metaphor. It is a structural analogy of the most direct and most consequential kind. Sneferu's building program was a rapid, failure-rich experimental process that produced the most consequential architectural breakthrough in human history within the span of a single reign. The modern regulatory environment is designed to prevent exactly this kind of process, to ensure that every building, every drug, every technology is fully tested and proven safe before it is deployed. The result is a world that is safer, more predictable, and more reliable than any previous civilization has ever managed to create, and also a world that is measurably less capable of producing the kind of transformative innovation that defined the most creative periods of human history. We have gained safety. We have lost audacity. We have eliminated the possibility of the bent pyramid. We have also eliminated the possibility of the red pyramid. The economist Tyler Cowen has written about what he calls the Great Stagnation, the phenomenon by which the rate of transformative innovation in developed economies has slowed significantly since the middle of the 20th century. Cowen argues that the low-hanging fruit of technological progress, the easy discoveries, the obvious applications, the innovations that required relatively modest investment and produced relatively dramatic returns, has been largely picked, and that the remaining fruit of technological progress hangs higher on the tree, requiring more investment, more time, more institutional patience, and more tolerance for failure than modern institutions and modern political cultures are typically willing to provide. The Dahshur evidence suggests a complementary explanation. The stagnation may be caused not only by the difficulty of the remaining problems, but by the institutional environment in which those problems must be solved. A civilization that cannot tolerate visible failure cannot produce the kind of rapid, iterative, experimental innovation that the most difficult problems require. And the modern world, for all its rhetorical celebration of innovation and disruption, has created an institutional environment in which visible failure is more costly, more career-threatening, and more legally and financially dangerous than at any previous point in human history. The educational system reinforces this intolerance at the individual level. Students learn from the earliest years of formal education that mistakes are to be avoided, that errors are marks of incompetence, that the correct answer is the only acceptable answer. The grading system rewards accuracy and conformity and punishes experimentation and deviation from established norms. The testing regime measures conformity to established standards and predictable outcomes rather than the capacity for original thinking or creative problem-solving under uncertain conditions. The entire institutional apparatus of modern education is designed to produce graduates who can replicate known solutions, rather than graduates who can generate new ones, who can avoid mistakes rather than learn from them. who can follow procedures rather than invent them. The system produces competent executors. It does not produce Sneferus. It does not produce builders who are willing to attempt something that has never been done before, and who are prepared to live with the consequences of failure if the attempt does not succeed. The result is a generation of professionals who are extraordinarily skilled at operating within established parameters and extraordinarily reluctant to step outside them, who can optimize existing systems with remarkable efficiency, but who cannot produce the kind of radical innovation that requires stepping into the unknown and accepting that the outcome may be failure. The space industry offers a contemporary example of a domain in which the balance between safety and experimental courage is being actively renegotiated, and the Dahshur parallel illuminates the negotiation with particular clarity. For decades after the Apollo program, the American approach to spaceflight was dominated by the Space Shuttle, a reusable vehicle that was designed to make space access routine and reliable. The shuttle was an engineering marvel, but it was also an extraordinarily complex and expensive system that, despite its reputation for reliability, experienced two catastrophic failures that killed 14 crew members and grounded the entire program for years after each disaster. The shuttle era was characterized by an extreme intolerance for failure that manifested as a labyrinthine system of safety reviews, engineering approvals, and management oversight that consumed enormous resources and that made every launch a bureaucratic ordeal. The system was designed to prevent failure. It failed anyway, catastrophically, because no system of reviews and approvals can eliminate risk from an inherently dangerous activity. The emergence of commercial space companies in the early 21st century has reintroduced an element of Sneferu-like experimentalism into the space industry. These companies have adopted a methodology of rapid prototyping and iterative testing that explicitly embraces failure as a learning tool. Test vehicles are launched with the expectation that some of them will explode. Structural failures are analyzed, the designs are revised, and new prototypes are built and tested within weeks rather than years. The approach is expensive, politically controversial, and visually spectacular in its failures. Rockets explode on launch pads. Test flights end in fireballs. The media records every failure with the same fascinated attention that a visitor to Dahshur gives the bent pyramid's angle change. But the approach works. It has produced, within a remarkably short period of time, reusable rockets that have transformed the economics of space access and that are now being used to build infrastructure for missions that the shuttle-era approach, with its intolerance for failure and its bureaucratic overhead, could never have achieved. The parallel between Sneferu's building program and the modern commercial space program is so precise that it borders on the uncanny. In both cases, an experimental approach that explicitly embraces failure has produced breakthroughs that a cautious, safety-first approach could not have achieved. In both cases, the failures have been visible, public, and politically embarrassing. In both cases, the critics have pointed to the failures as evidence of recklessness, while the practitioners have pointed to the failures as evidence of learning. And in both cases, the final result has vindicated the experimental approach, producing achievements that the cautious approach, for all its institutional sophistication and regulatory rigor, could never have matched. The implications of this trade-off are not simple, and the Dahshur evidence does not support any easy answers. No reasonable person would argue that we should return to a world where buildings collapse, drugs harm patients, and experimental technologies injure their users without legal consequence. The regulatory frameworks that protect modern life are genuine achievements of human civilization, as important in their own way as the engineering innovations they constrain. But the Dahshur evidence suggests that these frameworks come at a cost, and that the cost, measured in lost innovation, lost experimental courage, and lost capacity for transformative breakthrough, is higher than most people realize and higher than most institutional cultures are willing to acknowledge. The question is not whether to regulate. The question is whether we can find a way to regulate that preserves the essential protections of the modern regulatory state without eliminating the possibility of the kind of productive failure that has been the engine of every major advance in human civilization, from the invention of the true pyramid to the development of powered flight. The bent pyramid suggests that the answer exists, but that finding it requires courage, the same kind of courage that Sneferu displayed when he changed the angle of his pyramid rather than watching it collapse. It requires the courage to accept imperfection in the service of discovery, to tolerate visible failure as the price of eventual success, to acknowledge that the path from the unknown to the known necessarily passes through the territory of the mistaken, and to build institutions and cultures and regulatory frameworks that make room for the bent pyramids of the present, the imperfect, the compromised, the visibly flawed experiments that generate the knowledge needed for the achievements that the safe, the cautious, and the risk-averse could never have imagined on their own. The sun sets over the Dahshur plateau, and the two pyramids catch the last light of the day in different ways. The bent pyramid's surviving casing stones flash white, then gold, then amber as the sun drops toward the western horizon, the polished limestone surfaces performing, one final time, the function they were designed for more than 4,500 years ago. Catching the light of the sun and reflecting it back toward the sky. For a few minutes, in the last light of the Egyptian afternoon, the bent pyramid looks the way all pyramids once looked, luminous and alive and impossibly bright against the darkening desert. 2 kilometers to the north, the red pyramid, stripped of its casing, absorbs the light rather than reflecting it, its reddish coarse stone glowing with a warm, internal radiance that earned it the name by which it is known today. The two pyramids, one bright and one dark, one cased and one stripped, one imperfect and one perfect, stand in the desert like two halves of a single sentence, the first half a question and the second half an answer. The question this documentary began with was what happened at Dahshur and why the site has been forgotten. The answer is both simple and profound. Dahshur is the place where the true pyramid was invented, through a process of trial and error that produced 3 monuments, one collapsed, one bent, and one perfect, across the course of a single extraordinary reign. It has been forgotten because the modern world remembers the finished product and forgets the process that produced it, celebrates the success and ignores the failures that made the success possible, honors the son who built the Great Pyramid, and overlooks the father who invented the form that made the Great Pyramid achievable. This pattern of remembering the perfecter and forgetting the inventor is not unique to Sneferu and Khufu. It repeats across the entire history of human achievement. We remember Shakespeare, but not the Tudor dramatists, who developed the theatrical forms he perfected. We remember Newton, but not the natural philosophers, who formulated the questions he answered. We remember Edison, but not the dozens of inventors, who developed the components he assembled into a working light bulb. In every case, the person who perfected the form receives the credit that belongs, at least in part, to the people who developed the form through the messy, uncertain, failure-prone process of experimentation. The perfecter stands in the spotlight. The experimenters stand in the shadows. And the lesson of Dahshur is that the shadows deserve as much attention as the spotlight, because without the experiments, there would be nothing to perfect, no form to refine, no foundation on which to build. Sneferu built that foundation. He built it at Meidum, where it partially collapsed. He built it at the bent pyramid, where it bent. He built it at the red pyramid, where it finally stood straight and true and perfect. The foundation was not glamorous. It was not photogenic. It did not produce monuments that the modern world finds easy to celebrate or to understand. But it was necessary, it was essential, and it was produced through the only method that has ever reliably generated genuine innovation in any field of human endeavor, the method of trying, failing, learning, and trying again. But Dahshur should not be forgotten. It should be remembered as the birthplace of the true pyramid, as the laboratory where the most consequential engineering decisions in the history of architecture were made and tested and revised and tested again, and as the monument to a king whose willingness to fail publicly, repeatedly, and at enormous cost produced the knowledge that changed the skyline of Egypt and the imagination of the entire world. Sneferu was the greatest builder in Egyptian history, not because he built the largest, or the most perfect, or the most visually impressive pyramid, but because he built the first true pyramid, and because the path to the first required him to build two others that were, by any conventional standard of architectural success, failures. The failures were the price, the knowledge was the product. And the product, applied by Sneferu's son Khufu at Giza a generation later, became the most famous building on Earth, the only surviving wonder of the ancient world, the monument that has defined Egypt in the human imagination for more than 4,000 years. The debt is real, it is unpaid, and the bent pyramid, standing in the desert with its broken profile and its gleaming casing, is the receipt, the permanent record of the investment that made everything else possible. Somewhere beneath the sand of the Dahshur plateau, between and around the visible monuments, there are foundations and shafts and processional ways that have not yet been excavated and that may hold discoveries as significant as anything that has been found in a century and a half of archaeological work at the site. The story of Dahshur is not finished. New discoveries await future archaeologists, future scholars, future generations of curious minds who will make the journey to the forgotten pyramid field between Giza and Saqqara, and who will find, in the limestone and the sand, answers to questions that we have not yet learned to ask. The site is patient. It has been waiting for 4,500 years. It can wait longer. The stone does not hurry. The desert does not forget. And the monuments, imperfect and perfect alike, bent and straight alike, failed and succeeded alike, stand in the silence of the plateau and tell their story to anyone willing to make the long journey and to listen carefully. There is a quality of light at Dahshur in the late afternoon that exists nowhere else in the Nile Valley. The plateau is elevated above the cultivation, and the air is clear of the haze that softens the light at lower elevations. The sun strikes the limestone with an unfiltered intensity that reveals every surface, every joint, every variation in the colour and texture of the stone. In this light, the bent pyramid's casing seems to glow from within, as though the stone itself were generating the radiance rather than merely reflecting it. The ancient Egyptians believed that the pyramids were machines for transforming the dead king into a being of light, for converting the material body into a spiritual substance that could ascend to the sky and join the circumpolar stars in their eternal circuit around the celestial pole. Standing at the base of the bent pyramid in the late afternoon light, watching the casing stones catch the sun and throw it back across the desert in sheets of white brilliance, it is possible to understand why they believed this. The pyramid does not merely reflect light, it seems to produce it. It seems to concentrate the diffuse radiance of the desert sky into a focused beam of stone-born brightness that is directed upward, toward the apex, toward the point where earth and sky meet, toward the place where the king's body was supposed to be transformed into something eternal. The bent pyramid stands in the desert with its broken profile and its gleaming casing and its 4,500 years of structural endurance. It does not apologize for its shape. It does not explain itself. It does not offer excuses for the angle change that the entire world has spent millennia questioning and debating and theorizing about. It simply endures, imperfect and honest and magnificent in its imperfection. The most complete surviving monument from the age of the Great Pyramid builders, the best preserved large pyramid in Egypt, and the most eloquent testimony to the courage that genuine achievement requires, and that genuine achievement has always required and will always require. The failure was the foundation. The foundation has held for 45 centuries, through earthquakes and sandstorms and the slow erosion of wind and rain and the periodic depredations of tomb robbers and stone quarriers, who took what they could carry and left the rest standing in the desert sun. And the monument that was supposed to be superseded by something better, something taller, something more geometrically perfect, something more theologically correct, has outlasted everything that came after it, its casing intact, its profile unchanged, its story still being told in the quiet language of limestone and light, on a desert plateau that almost no one visits, 40 kilometers south of Cairo, in the place where the true pyramid was born, where the most famous architectural form in human history was invented through the most ancient and most honourable and most necessary of all creative methods. the willingness to try something that has never been done before, the courage to fail when the attempt does not succeed, and the persistence to try again until the stone finally obeys the vision and the vision finally becomes real.